years ago. On the day of Halloween, me and my siblings were giving out candy for trick-or-treaters. We planned to scare some kids with our costumes, and we had a nice and creepy setup. It was all going really well. We scared a few kids and gave out the candy as planned. Then all of my neighbours who were giving out candy eventually went back into their houses at about 11 PM because it was getting a bit late. It was about 11:30 PM when we noticed that there was a man in the middle of the road, about 80 feet away from us, just staring at our direction. We shrugged it off and thought it was just some douche that wanted to scare us. About 15 minutes passed and the man was still there. He suddenly walked towards us and held out his candy bucket and said, "Trick or treat." We started to get a bit nervous, but what could we do? We gave him some candy and the man went back to his spot from before and kept staring at us. We thought it would be better to go back inside, and so that's what we did, creeped the fuck out by this guy. We all stayed up late there, checked the window where I could be able to see where he was at before. What I saw next still haunts me to this day. The same man was now in the damn driveway. The creepiest part was that he was wearing a fucking Leatherface mask and he was waving at me when he spotted me. He then put his index finger to his lips and went, while holding something behind his back. I was so shocked that I couldn't scream. I wanted to, but I just couldn't. I went back to my room and told my dad about it. He got up and went outside with a pistol, but couldn't see anything and just told me to go back to sleep. I literally did not close my eyes for the whole night while my siblings slept like babies. At around 3 AM, I heard some rustling outside my window. Knowing it was him, I was too scared to check my window and just froze trying to make out any noises. I then heard some knocks at my window and I could tell that he attempted to open it. Too scared to get up, I reached for my phone that was right next to me and called my dad and told him what was going on. He went back outside and told me that there was nothing. Eventually, the noise stopped and I went to sleep somehow. I soon forgot about it, and when I brought it up a few weeks ago, my dad told me the real truth about what happened that night. He said that the first time he went outside, he saw a man with an ugly mask, and he just waved at him and walked away, holding a basket full of candy. The second time, he only found a note that contained the phrase, "trick or treat." I don't know what this man's intentions were, and I don't know what would have happened if my dad had not gone out the first time with his pistol, and it still creeps me out to this day when I think about it. I don't know if that man was just being creepy, or if he had other intentions in mind.
Number 8.
I had moved to my mother's hometown in Idaho to be closer to her and her side of the family when I had this experience last Halloween. I wouldn't say her town is very big and there isn't much to do, even on the holidays. I didn't know the town well yet and had just started a new job at the local paper. I worked nights and often found my car to be the only one in the secluded parking lot. I didn't mind this so much because I'm a very private person and I like being alone. However, I had just started dating a friend who was slowly pushing me to perform at local shows. I'm a musician and have been writing music for about 9 years. He works as a booker for a venue in town and asked me to open a late Halloween show. I had just finished up my work for the night. It didn't feel like an odd night, though I was nervous about playing my set in an hour or so. It was around 9 PM when I started closing down my computer and gathering my things. The building is old and sort of falling apart. It's next to a road that connects to the highway, so at night there's really no one around. It's also neighbours with train tracks. While the trains aren't running, they're stored in the open on these tracks. The back door that I use daily exits to a side parking lot. The left side is cut off by rows of trains. The right side is the highway, and the back is a grassy area with small abandoned warehouses. The lot itself is barren, with cracked concrete and a large green dumpster at the end of the building closest to the trains. I used my keycard to open the door, and like most nights, my car was the only one in the lot. I had parked towards the back, but the lot wasn't very big, so I would be at my car in no time. I didn't see anything unusual as I scanned the immediate area for anything suspicious. I'm an extremely cautious person and try to be completely aware of my surroundings at all times. So, I was caught off guard when I turned to close the door and heard a low growl. It was like an imitation of my dog's growl, but it was somehow broken. It started low, but the voice would crack, causing an almost glitch-like sound. I froze, with my hand on the doorknob. I considered running back inside, but something stopped me, and I slowly let the door close and lock. I turned towards the sound. A figure was peeking out from behind the shadowed dumpster. I couldn't make out any features, but its eyes were like fire. They shined so bright that it hurt to look at them. I could make out this thing's arm, which was incredibly long and skinny. It looked like it had too many joints, like it had 2 elbows. The growling continued, but as it crept little by little out from the dumpster, the growling lessened until it was no longer growling at all. At this point, I could almost see its whole body. It did in fact have 2 elbows on both arms, and its legs looked like the hind legs of a dog. All the proportions of this thing were off. Its torso was too small, as if its hips and rib bones were touching. Its legs were as long as its arms, but looked too skinny to be able to support its weight. The hands and feet were also elongated, with tiny claws at the end of dead-looking fingers. It had no tail, no horns, no ears of what I could see. It was wrinkly, like a hairless cat, and its skin was a pale grey colour. It looked like it had never been in the sun. I wanted to vomit, but before I could do anything, I saw its face. It was mostly hairless, with tufts of matted fur misplaced all over its head and body. Its jaw was crooked and too big for the rest of its body. It looked similar to a snake's jaw, which frightened me even more as I pictured it eating me whole. As if it could hear my own thoughts, it laughed, a guttural, robotic ha-ha. I could hear thick liquid fall from its mouth and hit the pavement. Its breath was heavy and it was wheezing really badly. It looked up at me, still crouching about 10 feet away, and said,
"Blue eyes. I like them."
I have blue eyes, and they were tearing up as I was convincing myself that I had lived a good life to die at 21. It laughed again, but this time it was the sound of my own laugh over distorted voices. It rose slowly. It looked like it was at least 7 feet tall, and it would be able to grab me after one step. But with a loud, high-pitched, cracking scream, it turned and ran on its hind legs to the trains. Though the tracks were close, it was impossible for a human to reach them in the time that this thing did. He turned one last time to look at me, then crawled between 2 of the train cars. I was finally able to move. As I realized that I had no idea what the fuck I just witnessed, I threw up harder than I ever had before. Before this incident, I was a serious atheist that didn't believe in the paranormal. In fact, my boyfriend is also an atheist, so I've never told him what happened. I haven't told anyone what happened because I know it sounds so ridiculous. I never saw it again, but Halloween is coming up and I have to work late in the same building. I'm hoping that it doesn't visit me again.
Number 7.
I used to live near a farm, and every Halloween they'd have several weeks of festivities. These festives included attractions such as the haunted hayride, the haunted house, and the haunted corn maze. In fact, now that I think about it, they use the word haunted in almost every attraction. I think the only things that weren't haunted were the bonfire and the hot dog stand. I'm a 22-year-old female with 2 24-year-old close male friends I met in high school. I was moving away soon, and we wanted to spend as much time as we could together while we still could. So of course, we decided to go to the farm festivities together. It was pretty fun. I especially loved the haunted hayride because they had some pretty hunky actors. But the haunted house was a bit much for me. I hate small enclosed areas, and will get freaked out pretty quickly when a lot of stuff is happening in a tiny place. I knocked over and nearly trampled my other friends several times. So when we got outside to an open cornfield, I was relieved. And while that part was the least scary to me, it may have been the part where I was in the most danger. Standing in front of us was a man dressed up in some typical haunted house gear. A fake chainsaw prop, a pale white mask, scraggly clothes wrought with red stains. He began talking, and the first thing out of his mouth to me was,
"Are these 2 your little fuck buddies?"
I gave a guffaw of laughter. The mere thought of these lovable dorky oafs I'd spent years being buddies with, and me being involved like that, was so out of this world to me that all I could do was laugh. It was such a funny thought that I played along and told him yes, which got my friends joining along in the laughter. But the man didn't laugh, he just kept talking. He started saying things like how he was going to watch us go at it, and then he was going to torture us after we did it, and that he would even join in. He continued to go into great detail. My friends and I just kept laughing, more nervously now, like if we stopped laughing, this wouldn't be a joke anymore. It would just be this weird older guy in a cheesy Halloween outfit talking about how he wanted to have sex with all of us. Finally, he revs up his chainsaw prop and tells us that we have 10 seconds to run, and if he catches us, he's going to murder my 2 friends and rape me. Relieved to finally get away from this guy, I burst off into a jog through the cornstalks for a bit and then begin to taper off into a walk again. But my 2 friends keep yelling at me to run. Confused and frustrated because I'm lazy, I oblige them and continue to run until we arrive at the next part of the haunted house. I ask my friends who kept telling me to run, and they tell me it's because the man was right behind me the whole time. The part that makes this whole thing seem a little bit more sinister than just a corny haunted house actor was what came while we made our way to my friend's car in the parking lot after enjoying the rest of the attractions. We came across a man hanging around while we made our way through the dark. He asked us how we liked the fair. He made it seem like he was on edge about entering or not, which doesn't make much sense now that I think about it. Why would some guy be hanging around the parking lot deciding whether or not he wanted in, especially since the farm was only half an hour away from closing? The part that stood out to me was, as we said our goodbyes to the strange man, I felt his eyes rake up and down my body, and he asked me how I liked the part in the haunted house in the cornfield. I'm sure that if this guy had really tried anything, he would have been in for a nasty surprise. As a teenager, I received my black belt in a form of Korean martial arts based around self-defense called Tang Soo Do, but I wonder if things would have been different for another girl that night. One with perhaps a smaller frame, a meeker inclination, and maybe not traveling with 2 other guys, each over 6 feet tall.
Number 6.
I am a female senior in high school and an avid runner. I spend at least an hour most days in the wooded hills behind my house, running the trails. In my runs, I've seen some pretty weird stuff, but this one has to be the one that freaked me out the most. This was during the outbreak of supposedly killer clowns in late 2016. People kept talking about how there were sightings all over, but no one ever actually saw one or directly knew someone who did. Because of this, I mostly considered the whole thing to be a hoax and continued with my late night runs. It was a Friday, and I was just entering the park at the foot of the hills as the sun was getting low in the sky. It was no big deal to me, just meant more open trail. The park was empty for the most part, except a few kids from my school smoking weed. I waved, and one of them I knew from my English class flagged me down. Grudgingly, I talked to them for a few minutes, and they rambled about some guy lurking around and how he was kind of freaking them out. I didn't think too much of it, assuming they were high or something. But just in case, I did take my headphones out of my ears. It was nice to enjoy the sounds of nature anyways. By the time I had managed to find a break in the conversation to excuse myself, it was significantly darker than I wanted it to be. Not night yet, but late evening. I knew that I would have to avoid the park ranger later while trying to get out, but that was honestly all that was worrying me. Nothing too important happened up the whole run up the hillside, but I was a bit on edge. Maybe I had taken some of the stoner's words to mind, as every rustle caused me to jump, and there were a lot of rustles, loud ones too. I forced myself to assume rabbits or maybe deer, but there was still that nagging doubt. When I had finally reached the hilltop, the rustles had quieted down and the whole thing was out of my mind. The city below me sparkled in the darkness, and I took a moment to relax against a tree and zip up my hoodie, as the night air had gotten a little chilly. And that was when I saw him. Trudging up the other side of the hill from the trail I needed to go down was a fucking clown. An incredibly stereotypical one too, with the big collar, fat belly, and frizzy hair. He even had balloons in his hand to complete the look. But one important thing I noticed, no weapon. Immediately, I ducked behind a tree, hiding in the shadows. guy bent over and took a breath, obviously not noticing me. Probably a practical joker looking for some late hikers. But that's when the adrenaline hit. I whipped out my phone and started recording, addressing my Instagram followers and whispering how I was going to unmask a clown. Yeah, real smart of me, right? I guess, really up until this, I was in that teenage phase where you think nothing can hurt you. Plus, I was pumped on adrenaline and had a pocket knife, which was more than he had. So I, for some stupid reason, thought that it was a great idea. "Hey, fucker!" I yell loudly, startling the guy. "You think this is funny, asshole? You better fucking run, clown, or the whole world's gonna know what a sick fuck you are." I took a few steps forward, hoping he would run. I guess even in my pump state, I was still cautious. The man just leered at me, cocking his masked face. Then, he lifted his head as if to look behind me, and broke into a sprint in the opposite direction. "Yeah, that's right, you better run." It was at this moment that there was a loud cackle behind me, causing me to whip around. Behind me, tearing out of the bushes, was the reason the clown ran. There was another, and unlike the other, this one was wearing all black with the clown mask. No real creepy clothing, but the thing that terrified me most was what he was carrying. A fire axe. This was where I lost my shit. Fuck this man. I didn't care if this guy was a practical joker or not. I was sure as hell not going to wait around to find out. He howled and cackled, screaming like a madman behind me as I flew down the hill. My heart was pounding in my ears and I glanced back, only to see him around the corner. He was gaining on me. At this rate, I wouldn't make it out of the park in time, but I had one thing I was hoping would be going for me, and not him. I knew these hills. So, as we rounded a corner, I did the only thing I could think of. I leapt off the trail, throwing myself off a 5-foot ledge and into thick clusters of bushes that covered the ground. Unfortunately, the bushes didn't pad the fall enough, and I tumbled, my ankle getting jammed against a rock, and my phone flew out of my jacket pocket. I just curled up there, hiding under the brush as best as I could. Well, I guess the guy either didn't see me, or he decided I wasn't worth jumping out into poison oak for, because when I finally looked up, there was no one on the trail. But I was not going back up there. Hell no. After a few feeble moments of looking for my phone, I gave up and began to limp out of the brush, heading down the hill, off trail. Long story short, the limp down the hill was tense and painful, but I made it to the parking lot where I ran into the ranger as she locked up. At first, she started to lecture me, as she always did when she found me out late, but as soon as she noticed my limp, she let me speak. We called the police on her phone, and I got a ride home while they searched the area. The next day, they came to my door and told me what they found. Sadly, they didn't find either of the guys, but they did find a car parked on one of the fire roads. The car had been reported stolen a week ago, and inside they had found duct tape, various pieces of black clothing, and a fire axe. Since this, I've not been within a mile of those hills, and I have advised everyone I know to do the same.
Number 5.
October 31st was always a letdown for me. Not because anything particularly bad happened on it, but more that I always missed that child sense of wonder I had on Halloween as a kid. I guess you could say that I craved it coming back. I'm 23 now, in college, and I still celebrated Halloween in college, but it was different. I wanted it to be joyful and innocent like it was when I was a kid again. Last year, I thought I'd try and reclaim some of that wonder by giving out candy to the local kids. I go to a large university and live in a small middle-class suburb that's pretty close to it. A few of my friends and I rent out a house together. Last year, my friends were drinking and going out to party that night, but I wasn't. All I wanted was to relax, watch some spooky movies and make some kids' days better. It was almost sundown. I just finished my homework and popped my favorite Halloween movie into the DVD player, Trick or Treat. The movie is an anthology of a bunch of different stories that tie together at the end. Whenever I watch it, it brings me back to the sense of wonder again, and I like that. I was about 30 minutes into it, and then I heard a knock at the door. Excitedly, I got up and grabbed a bowl of candy. I had an assortment of things kids might like, some of my favorites from when I was a kid. I had Reese's, Starbursts, M&Ms, and Kit Kats. I opened the door and there were two kids. They yelled trick or treat excitedly. I asked them what they were, even though it was obvious. One was a ghost and the other was dressed as a turtle. I threw them a handful of good stuff and they were happily on their way. This was the way the night went for the next few hours. Playful knocking, me giving out candy, and making pathetic attempts at humor. It was therapeutic actually. I liked making the kids happy and I was enjoying reminiscing with my favorite Halloween fix. I rarely took this much time for myself and it was great to have some peace and quiet. There came a point when it had been about 45 minutes since my last knock on the door. It was nearing 10 PM and I figured that it was well past the bedtime of most kids. I was thinking about closing up shop and calling it a night on giving out candy when, out of nowhere, a large heavy thud rammed against my door. I nearly jumped out of my chair. Was this some college kid playing a prank? I figured so. I know, I'm a college kid too, but I mostly keep to myself. I don't cause trouble. I got out of my chair, grabbed my baseball bat and walked over to the door. I peered through the blinds over the side windows and I couldn't see anyone. So I opened the door, stepped outside and looked around. It was dark now and I couldn't see very far into the night. I thought about yelling, but I knew if I did, I'd just be giving them exactly what they wanted. So I just yelled, "Happy Halloween, guys!" and threw some candy on the front doorstep. I figured leaving that there would be a nice positive way to tell them to fuck off. It had been about 15 minutes since the loud thud, and I figured my attempt worked. I had turned all the lights off and closed the blinds so any sign that anyone was home was absent. I didn't expect anyone to think I was home at this point, let alone prank me. Trick or Treat was in its final scene now. The little boy that played the spirit of Halloween was in the process of fighting an old man. I admit, it was cheesy, barely suspenseful, and did little more than intrigue you in hopes of finding out who the little boy actually was. The actual fight wasn't particularly riveting either, but just then, again, I heard the loud thud on my door. I didn't jump as much this time, as I almost expected it. I got up, paused my movie and walked to the door again. I didn't waste any time. I stepped outside immediately, bat in hand, and got into the front stairway looking around. What the hell? There was nobody there. These kids were fast, I thought. But then I heard the thud again. Shit, no wonder I wasn't seeing anyone. It wasn't coming from my front door. That thud was coming from the door to the backyard. This scared me. Our neighborhood was nice and my front yard was well lit, but the back of our house was facing a forest, a deep forest, and on the sides of our yard we had a fence, and it wasn't any small thing either. It was a good 8 feet tall and had sharp points at the top. Any thought of jumping over it would have deterred a lot of people. I went back inside and turned on all of the lights, including the spotlights in the backyard. I looked around for a few minutes and didn't see anything out there. But just before I called it quits, I saw it. A large man, probably at least 6 feet tall, just standing there, staring out from the darkness in the very back of my yard, right at me. He didn't budge when I saw him, he just stood there. I went back inside and went to my closet to swap my bat for something a little bit more intimidating. I grabbed my roommate's rifle and went back to the backyard. I opened the door, walked a few steps out onto our porch and yelled, "Look, I don't have a clue who you are, but you need to leave. I'm going to call the police and when they get here, you better be gone." I went back inside. I dialed 911 and told the man on the line that there was someone in the backyard. While I did this, he started walking towards me though. This was freaking me out. He started slowly just shuffling towards me. His shuffle turned into what I can only describe as nearly strides though. As my conversation with the police progressed, I backed up into the house and shut the door. At this point, the police said that they were sending an officer right away. I got off the phone with them, comforted slightly by the fact that I'd have help here shortly. Just as this happened though, the man stepped into the light. He was wearing a hockey mask, had menacing eyes, and in his right hand he had what was undoubtedly a knife. Even though he saw me holding a rifle, he walked without reservation all the way up to my back porch and slammed his left hand against the door while he looked through the side window at me. He kept doing this, just staring at me. Now, this next part is going to sound a bit ridiculous, but I swear it happened. I raised my rifle and yelled, "Get off my property now, or I swear I'm going to shoot you." But he didn't budge. Fuck it. I shot through the window and hit the bastard right in the neck. He fell to the ground and yelled. I rushed to the window holding my gun, ready to use this situation to my advantage. But when I got to the back door, there was only a patch of blood in the backyard, and I swear there was a blood-stained white sheet just laying there. The kind of sheet you'd see a little kid throw over himself with eye cutouts on Halloween. But nobody was in it. It was just there. The police arrived a little while after this happened. They took samples of the blood from the backyard, took the sheet to look into it and take a DNA sample from that too, and even scoured the backyard and the forest for the knife that the man was holding, or possibly even the man. They told me they'd keep an eye out for people entering hospitals with gunshot wounds for the next few weeks and would let me know if they found anything. My roommates finally got home from the party long after the police had left, and I told them the situation. I sure was glad to have them there, although I was pretty confident that the situation was resolved anyways. It would have been a huge undertaking for someone in that shape to come back and try anything. After a few minutes, I went to bed. I was settling in, turned on my lamp, and opened a textbook to do a bit of reading before bed when I leaned against my wall and felt something wet. Up against the wall, next to my bed, there was a caked layer of blood. I screamed and ran out of the house calling the police. I got my roommates out too, and we waited outside while the police came. When the cops showed up, they searched the whole house and stationed a patrol car out front for the night to watch over us. Their search yielded nothing. This was the last we heard of this for the next few weeks. We eventually got a call back from the police. They told us that they found a match for the DNA that they found at the scene. It was a match with a man in his 90s. Except, this man was dead. He died 25 years ago in this exact house in a drug deal that went bad. My roommates and I jumped ship with this one. We found a new place and moved out a week later. I still have no clue what was going on with that place, but it scares me to death. Was it some kind of hoax gone wrong, or did I actually see a ghost? Who was that man? Was the blood planted? I have no fucking idea.
Number 4.
This happened to me on Halloween of 2015. My friends and I, Jack, Will, Lucas and Sarah, had all made plans to go trick-or-treating together in Will's neighbourhood. It's important to keep in mind that Will's neighbourhood is not the safest. There was the occasional druggie and drug dealer, but other than that, his neighbourhood wasn't too bad. It was 8 PM and I was all dressed up in my Scream costume with the fake blood all over the mask. I got a call from Will and I accepted the call.
"Dude, where are you? We're all waiting. Lucas, Jack and Sarah are all here. Hurry up, man."
Will exclaimed. "I'm on my way," I said. I ran all the way to Will's neighbourhood and saw them waiting. Lucas was dressed as a clown, Sarah was Fiona from Shrek, and Will was dressed as Popeye from the Disney cartoon. We all gave each other hugs and we were on our merry way, going door to door screaming trick or treat. Everything was going just fine. We finished the last house and we were satisfied with the amount of candy we got, so we decided to go back home. Since Will was already in his neighbourhood, he was the first to leave. We were nearing the gate of Will's neighbourhood, and as we were walking through the gate, Lucas pointed out a Toyota van slowly following us. We all tried to reason as to why this van was following us, but we were all low-key scared shitless. We all decided to speed walk out of Will's neighbourhood, and we were huddled together because we felt safer that way. The entire time, I had a strong feeling of eyes staring at the back of my head. It made my skin crawl knowing that some creep was just watching us. As we were walking, the van suddenly sped up to the left of us and the window rolled down. I was met with a skinny man with bloodshot eyes. He smiled at us and I saw that he only had roughly 6 teeth, all of which were terribly yellow. My creeper alert went off instantly and it felt really hard to breathe with this man staring at us. We stared back at him and then he said,
"You kids want some more candy?"
And stupid Sarah said, "Sure." Now, keep in mind, Sarah was one of those people who could never say no to anybody or anything, no matter what they asked for. but myself and Lucas gave her the face of, "Are you crazy?" We noticed the man reach into the back of his car, and he came back with 3 bags of what I assumed was candy. He handed one to each of us. I opened the bag and saw your usual candy, Snickers, Twix, etc. Sarah said thanks, but before we could leave, he said something that gave me goosebumps.
Enjoy those candies, kids. They're extra good.
And then he drove off. Myself and Lucas were creeped the fuck out. A few minutes later, and we were all home. It was about 12 now, and I was tired. I poured out all of the candy in my bag, and I was happy to see so much candy lying on the ground in front of me. I grabbed the bag of the candy the man gave us. I had a very bad feeling about the candy in there. So just to check, I grabbed a fun-sized Snickers bar and I split it in half. And I saw something that will haunt me forever until the day I die. In one of the halves was a razor blade. I frantically grabbed my phone and called Sarah and Lucas. I warned them about the bag of candy the man gave each of us. I filed a police report the next day, and I gave them a description of the man and his vehicle, handing the officer the bag of candy the man gave us. Unfortunately though, the man was never caught. I never went trick-or-treating ever again. To all you parents out there, please check your children's candy every Halloween, because you never know what type of sick fucks are out there.
Number 3.
So this started in early 2013 and continued on until it peaked on Halloween night of that year. I live in a small town in Texas and there isn't really a whole lot to do. My friend Richard and I used to always meet up at the park after we got off of work just to visit each other. He would usually bring his girlfriend Katie along with him. I was about 19 when this all started. Richard and Katie would have been either 19 or 20. When we started meeting up, everything seemed normal. We would just stand by our trucks and talk about how much we hated our jobs. After a few weeks of doing this, we started to notice strange things happening around us. It started off innocent enough, but little did we know where it was going to lead us. The first thing that happened was we started noticing animals coming around and acting strange. Random cats would come and sit and calmly stare at us. They would appear out of nowhere and be sitting in front of our trucks when we tried to leave. I'll admit, it made us feel a little creeped out, but not too bad. We thought that maybe they belonged to the people that lived near the park. A few weeks later, my friend Dylan had joined us and we were standing on the jungle gym just visiting amongst the 4 of us. It was getting late and the police had come through to tell us that the park was closing soon and we would have to leave. By this point, the police knew who we were and knew that we weren't breaking any laws, so they had no problem allowing us to visit while they checked the rest of the park. As long as we didn't hold them from locking the gate too long, they allowed us to take our time leaving. I decided to use the restroom before leaving since I needed to go pretty bad and had a long drive home. I told the others that I would be back in a second, and to let the officers know that I was on my way back if I was still in the restroom when they came back to the gate. I walked to the restroom and did my business. As I started to walk back, I saw Richard walking to the restroom that I just came from. "You too?" I shouted to him, jokingly. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. This was really strange, considering that he is just as much of a smartass as I am, so he always had something sarcastic to say back. I brushed it off and thought maybe him and Katie had an argument. This wasn't unusual, so I just walked back to the trucks. Upon arriving at the trucks, I was shocked to see Richard standing there. There was no way that he could have gotten past me without me seeing him, and yet here he was, laughing and carrying on as usual. I told everyone what happened and they all seemed fairly surprised. We decided it was time to leave and we would come back the next night. A few nights later, our friend Johnny came along instead of Dylan and we decided to explore the woods behind the park. This area used to be a dumping ground for various gangs in our town, and who knows, maybe we would find something crazy. When we got into the trees far enough to where we could not see the park, we found a creek. We crossed it and found a walking path. Obviously, we weren't the first people to go through that area. We started following it, using only our cell phones as flashlights. I was in the front, with Johnny, Katie and Richard following, in that order. I looked back to make sure that I wasn't walking too fast, and noticed a black figure standing on the hill, watching us. I shone my light up at it to see what fucking creep was stalking us. As my light hit it, the figure just vanished. No sound or anything. It was as if it was never there. I turned around to keep going, and standing there, about 15 to 20 feet ahead of us, was a solid white figure with its hand out as if it was signaling us to stop. I shit myself and ran back to the trucks. I swear that I even walked on water when I crossed the creek. The next day, Johnny and I decided to go back during the day since we both had the day off and see what the figure was trying to keep us from. We followed the path through the woods and found out that it led directly to a bridge. We went under it and found a ton of graffiti. Everything from the usual gang signs and so-and-so was here to fucking pentagrams. This freaked me out quite a bit, so we decided to head back and call the others to let them know what we'd found. When we called them, Katie mentioned doing a paranormal investigation of the park since Halloween was coming up. I liked the idea since I grew up watching shows like Ghost Hunters. We started buying the cameras and everything, and I went to the parks department of our city government to ask permission to stay overnight in the park, and surprisingly, they gave us permission with little to no problem. Halloween rolled around and we pulled up in my Suburban. It was the only vehicle we had big enough to carry all of us and our gear. I decided we should drive around and check out the park before we got started so we would know how many people were still there and where they were. We made our rounds and were surprised to discover that the park was fairly empty. On our way back up to the front where the pavilion that we would use as a base camp was, we noticed a fog had rolled in. I found this a little odd considering the weather was not beneficial for fog this night. I then received a text from the police letting me know that they'd removed the last of the people from the park and we were now all alone and locked in. As I looked up, I saw a black figure standing directly in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes but ran right through it. Once the Suburban came to a stop, I heard a low voice whisper something directly into my ear that still gives me chills.
You should not be here. You will leave.
It said in the most demonic voice I've ever heard. I literally jumped out of the car, screaming as loud as I could. "Get me the thermal camera!" I shouted, knowing good and well that a regular camera would be useless in this fog. Richard handed it to me, and I began panning around with it, hoping to catch someone playing a joke on us. As I panned over to the trees, I realized that we were standing directly in front of the path through the woods that we took to get to the bridge. I was scared shitless at this point. I found a stump and decided to leave a voice recorder on it. We drove back up to the pavilion, and before we got there, the fog lifted just as quickly as it had come. We could now see completely across the other side of the park. I decided to walk back to the stump where I'd left the recorder. When I got there, I found that the recorder was knocked off of the stump. I picked it up and went to set it back on the stump. Before I set it down though, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. It came from directly in the trees in front of me. Knowing this used to be a dumping ground for gangs, I took off running back to the others. When I got back to base camp, we played back the recording. Oddly enough, no one else heard the gunshot, but the recording was even stranger. You heard nothing, absolutely nothing. Not me sitting on the stump, not it falling off. The first thing you could hear was me picking it off the ground, followed by a growl before hearing me taking off running. We then decided to split up. I took Richard and we went to the bridge. Johnny and Katie would walk around the perimeter and try to see if anyone was there. As Richard and I made our way to the path, we saw 3 figures walking a different direction, not even acknowledging us. We followed them to let them know that they weren't supposed to be here and we would call the police if they didn't leave. We followed them to a bend, only to discover that they had disappeared. It was then that we realized that they had led us directly to the bridge. We went under it and started recording. About an hour and a half to 2 hours into our time there, I began noticing shadows of people walking on the bridge. Richard went up to check it out, only to discover that there was no one there. Fucking lovely, I said under my breath. And then I heard it.
Fucking lovely.
It was the same voice that had whispered in my ear in the car, and now it was mimicking me. I turned to look in the direction that it was coming from, and I could see a figure in the water with its head sticking out from the nose up, just watching us. I turned to Richard, and I could tell from the look on his face, he was seeing it too. We got the hell out of there and never looked back.
Number 2.
I remember it like it was yesterday, although this occurred around what I want to say was my junior year of high school, maybe my senior year. Either way, it was over 15 years ago. The story takes place in an East Coast city of the United States. A few friends along with myself were roaming the neighborhood like a bunch of wannabe badasses looking for trouble on Halloween Eve, better known as Devil's Night, where I'm from. Devil's Night is when all the bad shit is done. TPing front lawns, egging houses, flaming bags of shit left on porches, followed by a ring of the doorbell and a dash into the night, etc. You know, the typical mischief for this time of year. Each of us had our backpacks filled with stuff like cartons of eggs and rolls of toilet paper. Now, as idiotic as we were to get ourselves in a sticky situation that I'm sure we'll never forget, we were smart enough not to be in the neighborhood that we were residents of. It wasn't super far away from where we actually lived, just a few towns over, probably a 30-minute walk there and back at best, but it was definitely far enough to where no one knew us. Plus, we had Halloween masks on to be extra sure. As we got deeper into the neighborhood, we saw other kids running around, acting wild already. So we said fuck it, let's get in on the action. We began egging homes, egging random people while walking their dogs, writing dumb shit on car windows with wet bars of soap, shit like that. While we were doing this, one of the guys with us mentioned that he kept seeing this truck driving around, a blue one with a truck bed on the back. We brushed it off and chalked it up to paranoia. Dude, relax, you're just freaking out because it's Devil's Night and you think people are out to get you. I told him. To be honest, he's always been a people watcher, if you will, always aware of his surroundings. I'm guessing he got that from his father, who was retired military. I don't know. But we went on to find out that he was spot on about this truck. After a while, it was getting late, and we were running out of devilish goodies, and one of our other buddies had asthma and decided to forget his inhaler as if we weren't going to be doing a lot of running. So we all agreed to wrap it up for the night and head back to our part of town. As we're walking towards the end of the street, my buddy says, "Guys, look, there's that blue truck again." It was pretty much in the middle of the street that we were walking up. It's probably just some idiots out here doing the same shit that we're doing, I told him. Then, all of a sudden, the headlights to the truck shut off. The street was really dark now. Any illumination mostly came from the outside lights of people's homes. Then, out of nowhere, this fucker darts towards us. We all stayed still in shock until the truck got about 10 yards in front of us. Then we made a dive towards the curve. "Are you fucking kidding me?" I screamed. We all looked down the street at the truck as it bent to a sharp left, tires screeching in the process. At this point, my buddy's asthma is really acting up, and to add insult to injury, he almost gets smacked by the truck. It was definitely time to call it a night. JW, one of the 4 that was with us, goes off. "Can you believe that motherfucker almost hit us? He didn't even slow down, that son of a bitch." We were all pretty pissed about it, but more glad that nothing happened to us. But JW was clearly pissed. "Man, that could have been so much fucking worse. We could have been badly injured or even killed." I said, "Fuck this. If we see this dickhead truck again, it's getting egged." He replies. Between the 4 of us, we had about 9 eggs left, and we got them ready just in case this fucker comes back around. At the time, we didn't want to argue with JW, but we all knew that this was a bad idea. As we began our journey home, we hear that same screeching from the tires. "Shit, here he comes," one of my other buddies say. We hid in some bushes and waited for the truck to reach the stop sign. Because we were at the corner house, it put us no more than 4 yards away from the truck. "Okay, as soon as this asshole pulls off, we let him rip," JW whispers. It felt like forever, but was maybe only 30 seconds. The truck peels off, and seconds later, we stand up, eggs in hand, and begin hurling them at the truck. I swear, every single egg landed. The truck comes to a screeching halt, and slams in reverse, coming back towards us. We take off, jumping a gate to a backyard which brings us to an alley. And to make matters worse, I notice that we're running the opposite direction of the town we live in, going deeper into this neighborhood that we knew little about. Seconds later, the truck darts through the alley that we're running up. We cut into another backyard, immediately looking for somewhere to hide as our buddy's asthma is getting worse. We hear the truck stop and the door open. A spotlight is going from one part of the yard to the other. This fucker has a flashlight, I said to myself. We were hiding for what must have been at least 15 minutes. No footsteps could now be heard, but we knew that he was still there, as we could hear the rumbling of the truck engine. JW makes a gesture as to take a peek to see if this guy was inside or not, and if he wasn't, we were going to try and make a dash for it. I gave him that look that I didn't think that was a smart idea, but he did it anyways. The second he pops his head up, a gunshot is fired and ricochets off of the tool shed that we were crouched down by. We fucking take off immediately towards the front of the house that we were hiding at, leading us back to the main street. We were running to the other side of the street when one of the guys with us loses his balance in the middle of the road. Honestly, of all fucking places. Just as he falls over, the truck comes screaming down the road. We manage to pull him out of the way just in time. The truck makes a U-turn, and at this point, we're cutting in between cars, waiting for the right time to make a run for another backyard. I noticed that a lot of the yards on this side of the street have yard gates that are at least 7 feet. Out of nowhere, another shot was fired. At this point, I'm thinking that this had to be a .45 Colt or a Magnum, because it fucking roared with every bullet. We dart towards the backyard as 2 more shots go off, ricocheting off the trees and concrete, and by some miracle, we manage to make it to a backyard. We hear footsteps running away from us, and the door of the truck slam, and not a second later, the truck peels away. My guess was the people in the neighborhood heard the shots, as we noticed porch lights coming on and front doors opening. All of a sudden, the back porch light in the backyard that we were hiding in comes on, and the back door swings open.
Who's back there? I have a gun. Show yourself. I won't ask twice.
A man says. We show our hands first as we step into the light to reveal ourselves, pleading with the man that we were just hiding from a maniac out there with a gun trying to kill us. He lowered his gun and stared at us for a few seconds.
Do any of you young men have any weapons?
We responded no, in a panic, still clearly scared from the night's events. The man invited us inside, and we felt really safe once we found out that the guy was an off-duty police sergeant. He made us call our parents to let them know that we were safe. He even went as far as contacting an on-duty police officer to take us back to our part of town. He asked if we knew the guy that was chasing us, and we told him we had no idea, and we didn't get a view of him or his license plate, so we couldn't give a concrete description. All we could say was it was a dark blue pickup truck. Thankfully, we made it back to our neighborhood, safe and sound, thanks to the police. Till this day, I always wonder if the guy knew who we were and was waiting for the situation to die down before he came back looking for us again. Either way, I was scared straight, and that was the last Devil's Night that I ever went out on.
Number 1.
In 1994, when I was 23, I decided to go on a week-long camping trip alone to get my thoughts together. I had just graduated from college here in California and needed to make some decisions about my future. I decided to go camping in Los Padres National Forest as I had been there before as a kid and it was quite peaceful. I packed my things, drove to the park and bought the week primitive camping pass I needed. I told my parents where I was going and they weren't too excited about me going alone, but because I'm a male and well built, they only asked that I packed a knife for protection, and I obliged. I parked my car and set forth down the trail that I had chosen. My plan was to hike to a small pond that was about 12 miles down the trail and spend my week there fishing, relaxing and thinking about what I should do with the rest of my life. I hiked from the morning to about 6 PM and took my time taking pictures, eating my lunch and even writing in my journal. At about 6 PM, I finally reached the pond and I unpacked my tent and equipment and got ready to sleep. I was so tired that I passed out and didn't wake up until the morning. In the morning, I made some coffee, made a PB&J sandwich and threw my fishing line into the pond. Over a couple of hours, I caught a couple of bluegill and was getting some much needed solitude. I gutted my fish and put them back into the water so they could stay cool for a couple of hours. After this, I went back to my tent and decided to take a nap. I fell asleep quickly. About 30 minutes into my nap, I was awoken by a woman crying hysterically from what seemed to be a few hundred meters away. I instinctively got up quickly and opened my
G'day mates, it's B Buster here, and I hope
Number 7.
This happened around 10 years ago. I believe I was 11 or 12. I still remember this like it was yesterday. Our house was kind of isolated. I mean, there were houses nearby and whatnot, but it was a bit further down the road. When I was younger, my family was in a bad financial crisis and we didn't have any fence or anything. We had a bush fence with a broken small door to the porch before the door to our house, and that's all we could afford. One night, I was playing some video games. I was alone with a friend of mine. My sister and my parents were out at the time. My female friend was 3 years older than me, which makes her 15. My family and hers were close friends for a long time. She was like a big sister to me. You could almost say that she was babysitting me. Anyway, she went to get some water and she comes back running towards my room and tells me to turn off my gaming console. I asked her why she was so scared and she turns off my PS2 and my light. She tells me to stay close to her. I start to freak out and she tells me that she saw 2 older men outside my house with a camera filming my house. My friend and I tiptoe around my house for a knife in the kitchen in the dark with no light anywhere, and I see one of the men trying to open our door by fidgeting the door handle. My friend starts to freak out and sees one of the men trying to pick the lock to the door or something. The other guy is nowhere to be seen. Now, my dad had a gun given to him by a close friend. My dad never used a gun before and never used the one he was given by his friend. My friend knew about this family gun and asked me where it was. I told her it's in my parents' bedroom at the top of the wardrobe. We both went to my parents' bedroom and my friend got the gun and loaded it partially with 2 or 3 bullets. Out of nowhere, we hear one of the windows breaking. We could hear the other guy very clearly, but still kind of muffled since they had a mask on. The one who broke the window was speaking to the first guy who was picking the lock on the door. He told him,
Hey, get away from the door. I found a way inside. Kill the kid and get the girl.
At that point, I sort of freezed and almost blacked out a bit. I couldn't think straight. My friend started running with my dad's gun pointing towards them and screamed at the top of her lungs,
If any of you motherfuckers hurt Igor or me, I'll fucking shoot your dicks off.
The men bolted just before entering the window, and my friend unlocks the door and started running towards them until she ended up on the street where my house was and shoots a warning shot into the air. I remember the shot being so loud since where I lived was a quiet place. She comes back inside the house, calls the police, my family and hers, and we tell the story to everyone. The police told us that there were some breaking and entering incidences near where I lived, and that some of the families were hurt, but no one was killed. Apparently, it seemed like these guys were amateurs. Many days passed and it seems like they may have found one, but they never found the other one. Thankfully, I've never had a similar experience to that ever again.
Number 6.
So, I'm a college freshman in the South. I'm also a female. Before I begin this story, I'd like to give a description of myself. I am a short, chubby black female. When I say short, I believe I'm just underneath average height, 5'4". I was across the street from a rundown gas station where I happened to work. On a night that I was working, my boss left me alone for that night because he hadn't gotten any sleep, or that is what he said anyway, but it was a pretty slow day. There wasn't a specific reason why it was slow, it just was. I was playing Geometry Dash on my phone as I sat behind the counter. It wasn't a counter with the thick glass and speaking tube. It was just a regular counter. As I played my game, I heard the door open with a little chime from the bells. I looked up to see a man, about average height and very skinny, but for some reason a little intimidating. I was never the one to be afraid of anyone, so when I say that he was intimidating, he was. He was balding, with a little comb over. He had on a dingy white t-shirt with holes and dad jeans that were caked in a dark red substance and mud. He seemed as if he had just been hunting, but I'm not sure. He looked at me. His eyes were hollow and empty, but still I smiled. "Hello, how are you?" Common southern hospitality. He muttered something. I couldn't hear him and went to the back of the store. I watched him for a while before I eventually had gotten bored and went back to my game. After about a minute of aggravation, I clicked off the game and went to scroll down Instagram. When I glanced up, he was standing behind the aisle, just watching me. Upon reflex, I put my head back down, looking at my phone, but something told me to look back up. When I did, he was standing at the counter, holding gummy worms and a beer. Did you find everything okay, sir?" I say, a little startled, but I was okay. He didn't say anything. He just dug through his pockets and pulled out a dirty $10 bill. "The total is $5.68, I say, as I grab the money, smiling at him. After I handed him back his change, out of nowhere, he shouts,
I hate all you niggers. You and the damn wetbacks.
Taken back by his comment, I couldn't say anything. I was just stunned.
Oh, you don't have nothing to say, huh? You niggers always have something to say. You never know when to shut your damn mouths. I swear to God, if I could hang you, I would.
I gasped and was about to tell him to get his fucking worms and can of spit and get the fuck out. But a few college guys burst through the damn door, alerting the both of us. He grabbed his shit and walked out. Luckily, one of the college students was someone that I had known. "Hey there," he smiled, bringing me some Doritos and an Arizona iced tea. I guess the look on my face gave him an idea of how I was feeling. "You okay?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, that man that walked out said that he wished that he could hang me. He started off with these racist comments. I didn't even do anything," I told him. I wasn't crying, I was just really mad. My friend asked if he should go look for him, and I told him no. "I'll be fine," I assured him. He nodded and asked for a pen and paper. I ripped a piece of receipt paper off and handed him the counter pen. "Okay, call me if you need me though," he says, writing his phone number down. His other friends come around with a bunch of food, and after that, they were on their way. After about another 2 hours or so, my boss and another co-worker came in, which means that I was off. I gathered my things, forgetting about the whole incident, and told them good day. I left and began my journey across the street. After about a good mile or so, I heard someone yell.
Hey sir, is there a reason for you to be here tonight?
I looked back to see campus security talking to a lanky man. My eyes began to focus into the darkness when I noticed that it was the racist guy from the station. His eyes were locked onto me, and it made me even more uncomfortable. He didn't respond, which made it menacing enough for me to leave. I began to walk quicker to my dorm, and just forgot about the whole thing. He was caught and I was okay. Nothing else happened. The next day in the Union Center, I was doing some homework at a table and listening to some music when the guy that I had known sat down. "Hey, I'm so glad you made it back okay," he smiles. I nodded. "Yeah, thanks." He sighs. "Because they found some guy on campus last night with a pistol and hunting knife." My stomach dropped when he said that. He was this skinny white man, and he kept mumbling some pretty racist shit under his breath. So I thought that was the guy that you told me about last night. He finished. I told him that I think that it was, and that he was following me back to my dorm last night. And as I thought, he was stunned for words.
Number 5.
My parents' house is modest but nice for the area it's in the north of England. When they chose that place back in the late 80s, they did so because it faces into a huge field, and in that area, greenery is in short supply. At the edge of the field, directly opposite their front door and window, is a dense line of tall trees. During the day, they make a beautiful view. At night though, they realized fairly quickly that the darkness just beyond those trees can be quite creepy. Not long after they moved in, they were burgled and were told by the police that, in all likelihood, the burglars had been watching the house from that tree line for days to learn their routine and wait for an opening due to a clear knowledge of the house's layout. After that, my father installed a house alarm. In the early 2000s, he installed a CCTV and a floodlight activated by motion sensor after a series of robberies in the area and some trouble with a group of local kids. The camera on the front captures their small garden, the dozen or so steps leading to the street, and a decent amount of the street beyond it. The floodlight normally activates if anybody gets anywhere past halfway down the steps. I went back to stay with my parents in autumn 2015 while I waited for my new apartment to be ready. They hadn't had any trouble from those kids for a long time, and there had been no reports of robberies in the area for about as long. Generally, it's the kind of place that I'd walk at night without giving it a second thought. Around 11 PM on my first night there, my father was at work and I was watching TV in the front room with my mum. Out of nowhere, there was a loud bang on the front window. I got up and went outside to investigate and was annoyed to find that the floodlight, it wasn't working. Lying in front of the window was a huge pile of dirt and rocks that somebody had obviously thrown from the front street. I looked up and down the street but couldn't see anything. I looked out towards the line of darkened trees, and again, nothing. But have you ever had one of those weird feelings like there are eyes on you that you can't see? I just couldn't shake it. After going back inside, I asked my mum if I should go check the CCTV recording, and she explained that it had stopped working years beforehand, but they'd left a very obvious camera in place as a deterrent. Smart, I thought, but not so useful in this kind of situation, and obviously not doing much as a deterrent either. She also explained that they'd switched off the floodlight because a bunch of local cats used to think it was hilarious to set it off all through the night. And although you couldn't tell from the living room due to all of the indoor lights, it wasn't so fun from the upstairs rooms when it went off every 10 minutes and you were trying to sleep. The next day, my father decided it was time he replaced the camera, just in case anything like that happened again. He opted for one with infrared so that you'd still get a decent view of the garden and the street at night. He installed it, hooked it up to a DVR and set it running from that night onwards. The thing was tiny, barely noticeable from the street, and on the opposite side of the house to the huge, obvious older camera housing. Again around 11 PM on night 2, there was another loud thud against the front window. This time, me and my father went out to investigate. Again, nothing there except a pile of broken apart rocks and dirt which had been balled up and thrown. We went back inside, rewound the DVR by 5 minutes or so, and watched. Interview strolled a guy in a hoodie with his hood pulled up to obscure his face. He walked parallel to the house until he was directly opposite the window, and stopped. He turned to face the window and just stood there, staring at the closed blinds for a good 30 seconds. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out what we assume was a clump of dirt, threw it and sprinted for the tree line opposite. We couldn't see how far in he went, but he slowed down just before dropping out of sight, so we assumed he was still there when we came outside, just watching. As I said, my parents dealt with this kind of crap from local kids for a long time, and they naturally assumed that that's what they were dealing with again. One of the kids, who was no longer a kid but an adult who hadn't done much growing up, still occasionally yelled things at them in the street, so he was a prime suspect. They agreed to switch the floodlight back on as an extra deterrent. The next day, my father dropped into the local police station and asked their advice on what had happened. Since there was no real damage done and the footage didn't actually capture a face, they said that there was nothing that they could do, but advised him to monitor the situation and come back if things escalated. That night, 11 PM came and went, and nothing. I remember my mother making a comment to the effect of being glad that whoever it was had obviously got bored and found something more interesting to do. Satisfied that nothing was going to happen, I had a quick cigarette at the front door, scanning the tree line as best as I could through the darkness, just in case, and then I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up early and looked out the bedroom window to the front garden. The gate leading to the steps was wide open, and I couldn't remember if it had been that way the night before. My mother was obsessed with it being kept closed and always complained about the postman leaving it open, so I assumed he must have done it again. When I got downstairs, there was no post waiting on the doormat. Not exactly damning evidence of anything, but it prompted me to check the DVR. I rewound it a couple of hours, and the whole time the gate was open, but no postman or anyone else for that matter. I kept going. 4 a.m., 2 a.m., midnight, open the whole time. As I rewound it all the way to 11 p.m. the night before, I saw a flurry of rapid movement on the recording. I played from 11 p.m. and the gate was closed. Around 11:15 p.m., a pair of headlights came from around the corner at the end of the street, and a large white van slowly pulled into view. It slowed more and more until it got level with the house and stopped. Out of it climbed the guy in the hoodie, again with the hood pulled over to cover his face. He reached across to the passenger seat and pulled out a heavy-looking bag. He gently closed the van door and walked straight to the front gate. He lifted the gate slowly from its catch and swung it open, making sure it didn't hit anything. Then he took a few steps down towards the door, cautiously. He stepped, looked around to make sure nobody was coming, and took a few more steps. Again he stopped, checked, and was obviously satisfied that he wasn't going to be confronted. Unfortunately for him, he took one more step and reached the halfway point on the stairs. On went the floodlight, lighting up our garden and our unwelcome guest. He froze again, clearly unsure what to do. Then he looked down at the bag in his hand and turned his face up to look directly towards the camera lens. The angle of both the floodlight and the camera meant I got a good look at just the bottom half of his face, and the big grin plastered all over it. And just like that, he turned around, strolled back up the steps and got into his van. With him gone, the floodlight switched itself off again. Except, he didn't leave. I watched the headlights get smaller as he reversed back the way he came and stopped at the end of the street, just within view. Then he turned off the engine and waited. At this point, I'd totally forgotten about the sequence of events from the previous night and felt a shot of ice go down my back when I saw a silver light appear as I opened the door and stepped just outside for a cigarette. I stood there obliviously scanning the trees in front of me, while 50 yards to my left, this guy sat, watching me. I disappeared back inside. A few minutes passed and the headlights flashed back to life, growing closer again. The van appeared behind them, crawling back to the house. It got right outside again, stopped for just a second and then pulled away, out of shot. Understandably freaked out, I told my parents and asked my father to go back to the police and tell them that we now had a trespasser. He did. Their response? That it was probably just somebody looking for directions, and in any event, without any way of getting an ID, it would be a waste of their time. They didn't even want to see the footage. Nice. We monitored the CCTV for the weeks I was there afterwards, but our nighttime visitor never came back. No idea what he wanted, why he was watching the house, testing our reactions, came calling when he knew that we were all home, or why he specifically targeted us in a row of terraced properties. But after getting a good look at that smile, I'm glad I didn't decide to go smoke a few minutes earlier that night.
Number 4.
It was about 9 years ago, and I was 14 at the time. My dad is an avid hunter, and although I never really caught the itch, so to speak, I still went with him pretty often. Just having the chance to escape to the wilderness was awesome for me. Anyway, it was in the middle of squirrel season and we left for the campsite one afternoon to set up and prepare for the next morning. That night, my dad told me that he decided that I was old enough to hunt alone. Here in the South, that's kind of a big deal. Something of a rite of passage, I suppose. He tells me that he knows of a good location for me to go to. So the next morning, we go down to the bayou from our camp in my dad's boat, heading for our destination. My dad pulls up to the shore and tells me that he'll be back in around 2 hours to pick me up. It was still early morning and the sun hadn't really risen yet, so I step off the boat and find a comfortable tree to sit under until the sun came up, seeing as I didn't want to get lost in the woods. Once the sun had risen enough for me to see, I took off through the woods. Since I wasn't that big of a hunter, I really wasn't looking to get any game. I was just enjoying myself. I walked north a bit, looking for any signs of squirrel. Tree branches shaking, broken nuts on the ground, that kind of thing. After a while, I found a small trail heading east and decided to follow it. When I say trail, I mean a deer trail, a path that some deer had cut through the woods. I walked maybe a good mile and bagged a few squirrels along the way. I realized that I've been walking for about 45 minutes, so I decided to turn around and head back to where my dad had dropped me off. Once I turned around, I noticed another trail leading into a thicker part of the woods. I hadn't noticed it previously, and normally wouldn't have paid much attention to it, except for the fact that the trees had these weird symbols drawn into them. I almost want to call them Nordic runes due to the size, but they were much more intricate. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go down the trail, which was stupid of me, and to this day I still don't know why I did. I had been in the woods all my life and never was scared, but being alone in the woods is much different to being with someone, so I guess I was a little shaken. Anyway, the more I walked down the trail, the more confused I became. I saw more and more of the symbols in the trees, but there was also an eerie silence, which is really weird. Normally, you'd hear a squirrel or something, but it's like this specific part of the woods was dead. I had walked about a half mile to the best of my estimations when I noticed that a part of the trees ahead became lighter. I knew that meant that there was a clearing up ahead. I wish I never stepped foot into that clearing. What I found still disturbs me. It was a man-made clearing, that much was certain. The ground had been disturbed from where the trees had been cut down and the stumps removed. The trees surrounding the clearing were also covered in these symbols. In the middle of the clearing was a large stump. This stump must have been around 5 feet across, and in the middle of it was a dog, or coyote. Its skin had been removed and its stomach cut open, its intestines spilling out onto the stump, some of it falling onto the ground. I wasn't immediately sickened by it. I've cleaned wild game before, so I was sort of used to that kind of sight, but I've never seen a dog like that. I decided to get closer for a better inspection, and what disturbed and sickened me the most was that this was fresh. There were no flies anywhere near the carcass, and I know from experience what a freshly cut open stomach smells like, and I recognized that smell immediately. It being a cold October morning, I could even still feel the heat coming from its body. I started looking on the ground around the stump. For what, I don't know, but that's when I noticed the footprints. There were tons of them, all circling around the stump, along with a knife with a decorative handle very close to the stump. It was then that I noticed that I could feel someone watching me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want whatever or whoever had done that to the dog to have a reason to do it to me as well. So, acting as nonchalantly as I could, I turned around and headed out of the clearing, looking into the trees. I was trying to make it look like I didn't care and went back to hunting. It must have worked because I made it back to the main trail just fine. As soon as I did, I hurried back to the spot where my dad dropped me off, facing the woods, my shotgun at the ready, just in case. I never mentioned it to my dad, seeing as he would more than likely put it off as me trying to be funny. However, I did ask my grandfather about it, seeing as he had decades of experience in the woods. After telling him my story, he said something in French that I didn't understand and warned me to never go back to that part of the woods. He also said that if it had not been for me carrying a gun, I would not be there to speak to him. He refused to tell me anything more about it, and I've never been back to that part of the woods since.
Number 3.
A couple of years ago, I was living with my then partner, now ex. We'd been watching TV and I felt sleepy, so I decided to go through to the bedroom for a nap. I started to drift off when I became aware of a pair of eyes watching me from between a crack in the bedroom door. I couldn't make out anything else, just the eyes. The hallway beyond was pretty dark, so I sleepily assumed that it was my partner standing in the shadows and messing with me. I laughed and mumbled a half-hearted piss off and turned over to sleep. Except I could still feel the eyes on me, and now I was getting annoyed. Without turning back, I gave a louder warning that I wasn't in the mood for joking around and I'd like to be left alone. After a few seconds, I heard the door creak open just a little more. Still half asleep, I turned back and delivered a barrage of swears at the door. It was about half open now, filled with the blackness of the hallway beyond. Right at the normal height were the eyes again, and below them a big, toothy grin. Not a friendly one either. The grin was fixed like a skeleton's, and the eyes were unblinking and creepy. Assuming my partner was just being a dick, I drifted off. When I woke back up, not long later, the door was still open and the eyes and smile were still there. I was about to launch into an epic, sweary rant when I heard my partner sneeze through the wall connecting the bedroom to the living room. It wasn't my partner standing in the doorway. I freaked the hell out and rolled myself off the side of the bed and onto the floor. By the time I managed to pull myself up to look over the edge of the bed, the door was still half open, but there was no one else there. My partner wandered in, looking confused, and asked what the hell I was doing to make so much noise. I explained at about 100 miles per hour and eventually managed to calm down. We checked the whole flat from top to bottom, but found nothing. I barely slept that night. Mostly, I sat in the darkness watching the door to make sure it wouldn't open. I was told by a friend that it was all just a hallucination caused by when the body is transitioning between sleep states. In addition to sleep paralysis, some people can experience extremely vivid hallucinations or other sensory illusions. After that, I laughed it off and even gave the imaginary phantom a nickname, Smiler. A week or so ago, I got chatting to one of my neighbours in the lobby of the apartment block. He happened to mention that he recently caught our mutual landlady letting herself into his flat one afternoon for what she tried to claim as a random spot check, which is totally illegal. Another neighbour now claims to have seen her letting herself into my flat while I've been out and taking her time about it when she was in there. I'm now less convinced than ever that what I saw was just in my head. I've tried complaining to the agency who manages the property, but without hard evidence, it's difficult to prove anything. Now, I keep my keys turned in the door lock whenever I'm home, and I've got a camera watching while I'm out. So far, nothing.
Number 2.
My first babysitting gig almost got me and the kids killed, all because of one mistake. I was 14 at the time, and this happened sometime in the summer of 2014. I had known these kids and their parents almost since I was born. Our neighbourhood was very friendly and our parents regularly did stuff together. I remember this night very clearly over 2 years later, and it still terrifies me. The night this happened, our parents were going out to some fancy adult-only restaurant to celebrate my mum's birthday with the kids' parents. They said they'd be home around 11 and to remember to lock the doors. They had 3 kids, Haley, Alex, and Madison. Haley was the oldest.
Number 4.
I live in a neighbourhood in an area full of quaint little eateries and other small shops, just a 30-minute walk away from my house. On this particular day, my friend and I had just returned from the beach and we were both starving. My mum, who had driven us there, along with my siblings and my friend's sister, said that if we were hungry, she would give us some money and drop us off at a small restaurant before driving herself and my siblings back to my house for a sleepover. She was too tired to wait around for us to order some food and didn't mind us walking back in the dark since our neighbourhood was relatively safe. After she dropped us off and sped away, my friend decided to order a sandwich and I ordered one for myself as well. We were both still damp from the ocean and covered in sand, so I was literally itching to return home and take a shower. The sandwich place was just closing since it was around 10 and getting very dark, so we immediately began walking back once our orders were finished. The walk from the little area full of shops to my house is pretty straightforward. You walk uphill until you hit an intersection. Then you turn right and begin walking downhill. So, sandwiches in hand, my friend and I began to walk. I was practically hobbling since my knees were bruised to hell after being tossed about by the violent waves. It was super dark and the sky was an almost oily black with no moon in sight. We were not nervous and talked about random things as we went. At the corner of the intersection, there is an old and rather run-down house that is fenced off by a huge hedge. The hedge is mostly solid, except for a couple of sections that were cut out of it and lead to the house's front door. The owner of the house is an old and stout woman who loves sitting on a lawn chair, smoking cigarettes and grimacing every time I give her a friendly wave. In the darkness, the hedge was a solid mass of black leaves and very difficult to see through. My friend and I rounded the corner and were about to begin the easier downhill walk when there was a bright flashing light, as if someone had blinked a flashlight on and off again at us, or something. We were dumbfounded and paused to look around in confusion. My friend laughed nervously and said,
That was weird. Maybe it was a street lamp or something.
I was still looking around warily when there was another flash, but this time I saw where it had come from. There was a figure. From the shape of the shoulders and chest, I assumed it was a man who was clothed entirely in black and held a camera in his gloved hands. The flash illuminated his grungy old hoodie and dirty jeans. He was crouching in one of the cutout sections of the hedge and pointing the camera straight at my face as I turned to look. My heart just about stopped. What the actual fuck was a man doing crouched in the darkness and taking pictures of my friend and I with the flash on? I quickly turned back and elbowed my friend, mumbling something along the lines of, "Keep walking, dude, just keep walking." We sped up, my friend facing forward whilst I kept turning to glance over my shoulder. The man in the hedge rose to his feet, and when we were about 10 feet away from him, he began to take long strides toward us, hands now jammed into his pockets of his black hoodie. My mouth was dry and my stomach twisted into knots as I began to walk faster and faster. This shit was something I'd expect to read or see in a movie, but never experience for myself. I felt totally unprepared, especially since my friend was with me and didn't even know there was a man following us. We were half running at this point, which was killing my bruised knees. Every step began to burn, but we continued walking downhill at an ever-increasing speed. Each time I looked back, the creep was closer and closer to us, making almost no sound and never faltering in his stride. My house is on a lot with a couple of others, the whole lot surrounded by an iron fence with an unlocked gate at the front facing the street. We bolted into the gate and slammed it shut, and my friend went to open the door of my house as I stood next to the gate and peered out to the street. He was gone. When we were finally inside, eating our sandwiches, I told my friend about the man and that he had taken pictures of us as we rounded the corner. We were both rather freaked out, my friend saying that my constant looking over my shoulder had put them on edge. I mentioned it to my mum, but she blew it off and we went to our sleepover like nothing had happened. The next night, I was home alone, waiting for my mum and siblings to return from the movies. There is a large window that faces the street in my room where I was sitting on the couch, and the blinds weren't drawn yet since I'm a bit of a lazy bastard. So I was sitting in front of this window and eating dinner whilst I was playing Skyrim on the PS3. A pretty average night, if I'm being honest. The volume was turned way up since I was home alone and there was no one around to complain. From the corner of my eye, I see movement. It's dark again, being almost 10:30, so I tell myself that it was probably just a cat or something, and go back to playing Skyrim. Then, there's a flash from somewhere near the fence. My blood runs cold as fucking ice. I'm sitting there in my robe and some motherfucker is taking pictures of me. Hell fucking no. I yanked the blinds closed and, not wanting to go outside and investigate, continued to play Skyrim. The doors were all locked and I figured I could just wait for my mum to arrive back home. That was yesterday. Now, it's about 11 o'clock and I'm in my upstairs bedroom, which has a huge window that also faces the street. I was lying in my bed, listening to some quiet music while I closed my eyes and tried to relax. My curtains were open, not all the way, but enough so that my bed was visible from the ground. It's almost completely silent until I hear the gate to the fence swing open. I turn off the music. Crunching leaves, which means someone is walking over towards my house. I assume at this point it's one of the other people who live in my lot. The crunching stops right below my window. I am warier now, and to be honest, a little nervous after the previous events. Wanting to go to close the curtains, I sit up on my bed in order to reach them, when there's another flash coming from right below my fucking window. I yank the curtains closed and jump back into bed, feeling sick and a bit panicked. The crunching leaves receded, and I heard footsteps walk away from my house back down the street. That was about 10 minutes ago. Something is going on. I've never been in a situation like this before, but based on the past events, I think that there might be someone stalking and taking photos of me. If something else happens, I'll let you guys know, but I hope that I won't have to. Update. First off, thank you all so much for your support and suggestions in the comments section. It has been a huge help knowing that I'm not completely alone in this situation. Secondly, I took a trip to the store and bought a motion detector porch light which I'm having someone install at the moment. Hopefully the new light will deter this wacko if he hasn't given up already. For the past couple of days, I've slept at a friend's house, and tonight I'm spending the night in my own house once more. Thanks again. Hopefully this will be the first and last update to my paparazzi stalker story. Stay safe, you guys.
Number 3.
So luckily this story doesn't involve me being chased, almost kidnapped, stalked, etc. But it is one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me. I think about whatever happened from time to time, and sometimes I feel as though maybe I was overreacting. But then I remember how I felt like my stomach was in my throat and my heart was going to burst out of my chest, and I know that my fear was justified. I never told my parents or the parents of the kids that I was babysitting, which looking back was probably really stupid. This happened when I was about 14. I had just started babysitting for this family in my neighborhood. They had 2 kids, a boy who at the time was 10 and a girl who at that time was 8. They were great kids to babysit. They got along with each other without fighting and always did what I asked of them without complaining. Before I launch into what happened, I'm going to give you all some background information about this family's house so you all can understand why I was so freaked out. The house is situated pretty far back in my neighborhood, on this little side street off of the main road that runs through the neighborhood. The house is in a cul-de-sac, so there's not a lot of traffic on this road at all. Usually, the only people that ever came into the cul-de-sac are the mailman and people who lived in the other 3 houses that were in the cul-de-sac. The street itself was not very long at all, so there were only 3 houses on each side of the street that weren't in the cul-de-sac. Essentially, despite being in a large neighborhood, the street that this house was situated on was very quiet, and if you didn't live in the neighborhood, you might not even know that the street existed. It was a fall Friday night, and I arrived at the house around 6 o'clock. The kids were already sitting down eating dinner when I got there, and the parents told me that they expected to be home around midnight or so. The parents also made a joke about how the kids had the whole street to themselves, since the other families that lived there were out of town for Thanksgiving. The parents left and the kids finished eating, and we went outside to play in the cul-de-sac. I remember locking the front door and taking the house key outside with me. The kids rode around on their scooters for about an hour. For some reason, I just felt really on edge while the kids were playing outside. I chalked this feeling up to knowing that we were alone on the street since everyone else was out of town. After the kids finished playing outside, we went inside to play Wii in the basement. I remember locking the front door once we were back inside and putting the key on the kitchen counter. I then checked the front door again before I went downstairs to the basement. I was super vigilant about checking the doors because I had watched so many scary movies where the babysitter forgets to lock the door and then some crazy murderer gets into the house and blah blah blah. As the kids are playing in the basement, I get that unsettling feeling again. I didn't feel like we were being watched. It was more like when you know that something is going to pop out in a scary movie and you're just anticipating it on the edge of your seat. The feeling sticks with me the entire time that we're in the basement, but again, I chalk it up to knowing that the entire street is empty. The clock strikes 10 and it's time for the kids to head to bed. We go to the top floor of the house where the kids' bedrooms are. The house is set up so that when you open the front door of the house and come inside, you're standing in the foyer with the stairs to go up to the top floor directly in front of you. If you're standing in the foyer, you can see all the way up the stairs into the bathroom on the top floor. So the kids are in the bathroom brushing their teeth and we all hear a car pull up in their driveway. I figure that it must be their parents coming home super early, and I expect to hear the garage door start opening. But that sound never comes. I walk into the girl's bedroom and look out her front window. There's a car running in the driveway, and there's a man in the car, but the headlights are turned off despite it being 10 PM and pitch black dark outside. I figured that it was someone who got lost in our neighborhood and was just using the driveway to stop and get their bearings before heading back out on the road. I leave the girl's bedroom and head back into the bathroom where the kids are. Suddenly, I hear a knock on the front door. I turn around and there's a man standing at the door holding a pizza box. There are 2 long windows on either side of the front door, so I have a clear view of this guy, and I know that he has a clear view of us. I immediately get that eerie feeling that I'd been feeling all night. I asked both of the kids if they ordered pizza for some reason, and they both said no. These kids were always very honest and wouldn't lie about something like that, or even order a pizza without asking me, so I knew that they were being truthful. Normally, I would have gone downstairs to see what this guy wanted. Maybe he had the wrong house and I could point him in the right direction. But that little voice in my head was screaming, "Do not go downstairs. Do not open the door." The guy also didn't look like he worked for any pizza company. Normally, they would be wearing a uniform or a hat with the company's logo on it or something. This guy seemed off. He looked like he was in his late 30s, early 40s and looked super disheveled. His shirt was really wrinkled, his pants were filthy and ripped, and he had this ratty black baseball cap that was pulled down super far so that his eyes were covered. He was also grinning really aggressively. Like, I thought this guy's teeth would just shatter because of how hard he was pressing them together. At this point, the kids notice him and start asking why he's here, should we open the door, etc. I tell them no and ask that they just go into their rooms and lie down. The boy goes to his room and I walk the girl into her room and look out the window at the car again. I notice that the car doesn't have one of those pizza delivery car signs on the top, which all of the pizza companies in my town require delivery drivers to have. So now I feel really confident in my initial intuition that this guy isn't a legit pizza delivery guy. The girl gets in bed and I come back out of her room and sit down at the top of the stairs so that I can keep an eye on this guy. I tried to stay really calm so as not to upset the kids, even though I was flipping out on the inside. He's still standing at the door holding the pizza box in one hand, and he's still grinning that teeth-shattering grin. His mouth almost looked too big for his face. Even though I can't see his eyes because of the hat, I know that he's dead-ass staring at me. Then, without breaking eye contact, he starts jiggling the door handle pretty aggressively, while still grinning. I silently thank God that I was so psychotic about making sure the front door was locked. He stops jiggling the handle and resumes staring at me. If I was in this situation now, I probably would have called the police immediately. But being only 14 and fairly new to babysitting, I was paralyzed with fear. I felt like if I took my eyes off of him even for a second, when I looked back, he would be standing at the base of the stairs. After about another 5 minutes of the stare down, he literally starts walking backwards off of the porch without breaking eye contact. This guy was walking backwards towards his car while staring at me. I go into the parents' bedroom, which also has a view of the driveway, kneel down in front of the window and peek out. I'm expecting to see this guy getting into his car, but no, the guy is nowhere in sight, but the car is still there. So I return to my perch at the top of the stairs, half expecting to see him again at the door, or worse, standing at the bottom of the stairs. But he was nowhere to be seen. After about 20 minutes, I hear a car starting. I run back to the parents' room, kneel in front of the window again, and notice that the car in the driveway has started and the guy is sitting in the driver's seat, still fucking grinning. He also doesn't turn the headlights on. He shifts into reverse and begins slowly backing out of the driveway, grinning the entire time. Right before he drove off, he turns his head and, I swear, makes direct eye contact with me. Again, I can't see his face because of the hat, but I know that he was looking at me. This is really disturbing to me, since he didn't really know where I was in the house. The parents' window is the farthest window to the right if you're looking at the house from the outside. The lights in the parents' bedroom are off and I'm kneeling down, so really the only part of me that might have potentially been visible is the top of my head, my eyes and my nose. But it's also pitch black outside. He doesn't have his headlights on, and it's pitch black in the parents' bedroom. So I doubt that I was really visible. He also didn't spend time scanning the windows. His head literally just snapped to where I was. It's like he could sense where I was. After I had time to calm down and collect myself, I started replaying what had just happened and came to the following conclusions. This guy was not a pizza delivery guy. He had no uniform, looked and acted like he was possessed or something, and his car was unmarked. Those 20 minutes or so that elapsed between when he walked backwards off the front porch to when he got into the car were probably spent walking around the house and checking all of the doors, trying to gain entry. I believe that he had malicious intent. Maybe he wanted to rob the house. Maybe he wanted to do something more sinister to me or the kids. Either way, this guy was bad news, and I'm glad that I trusted the voice in my head. I think he probably found some pizza box and tried to pose as a pizza delivery guy to get me to open the door for him. There are still some parts of the story that are confusing to me though. If he really wanted to get inside the house, why didn't he find a rock, a brick or something and throw it through a window? I mean, I'm very glad that he didn't, but I just thought it was a bit odd that he checked the doorknobs and then gave up after he discovered that they were all locked. Maybe he felt like doing something that made a lot of noise would alert me, and so he was trying to sneak in a more subtle way to try and catch me off guard. But why did he walk backwards off of the porch? Was it just to preserve eye contact and thus intimidate me? Or was this dude just insane? Why did I feel so unsettled early in the evening before the guy even showed up? Was he watching the house and waiting for the kids to go to bed and for me to be off guard before trying to get into the house? How did he know where to look when he was backing out of the driveway? Why was he grinning the entire time? Did he know that our house was the only house on the street that was inhabited at the time? Why did he pick that house, especially given the fact that it's on a very quiet and secluded street, and you have to drive pretty far back in the neighborhood to even reach the street? He could have picked the 50 or so other houses that you have to pass to even get to that house. The town where I live is upper middle class and has a super low crime rate, and drugs aren't really an issue. We're also surrounded by other similar upper middle class areas, so I'm doubtful that this person was on drugs or some crazy vagrant. Of course, I could be wrong. Maybe this dude was just jacked up on drugs. Maybe he was just a vagrant dude. Maybe he really was just a lost pizza delivery man with some unsettling personal quirks. But I'm really doubtful. Whatever he was, I'm glad that I haven't seen him since, that he never returned to that family's house, and that I had enough sense to triple check the front door being locked and listen to the voice in my head. Let me know what you all think what this guy may have been up to. I never told my parents or the parents of the kids, which, as I said, was a stupid idea. I definitely should have told someone about it. If he was really watching their house, they needed to know about it.
Number 2.
Just a little background. I'm a female and was 12 when this all started, and I lived in a very calm part of my estate in Ireland. My mum is involved too, but not as much as I am. So, on to the story now. It was 12 AM and had just turned Christmas Day when we got a knock on our door. I was taught not to open the door to strangers, especially when it's 12 AM, so I just ignored it and hoped whoever it was would just go away. About 3 minutes later, I heard another knock, but this time it was like a huge bang at the door. I was terrified and didn't know what to do, so by instinct, I went and got my mum to answer. When she answered, this drunk Romanian guy who had a very scruffy beard and was wearing a white hoodie was just standing there and asked,
Can I walk your dog? I have my dog with me, so she'll be fine.
And my mum, of course, said no. I was a bit away from the door, but that's all I heard him say. My mum kept politely asking for him to go away, and when she had had enough, she closed the door. The next morning, I was sitting having my breakfast, and my mum brings up the incident to my dad. So, me being me, I started eavesdropping and took off one of my headphones. I was really scared because that's the guy who stalks me in the bushes while walking Molly. That's our dog. When she said that, my heart sank so deep into my chest that it started to hurt. Fast forward 3 years and I'm home alone watching TV upstairs in my room when I just had this sudden urge to look outside my window. And let me tell you, I was terrified. The same man was standing in my empty driveway looking up into my bedroom. I got so freaked out and without hesitation immediately closed my curtains over. No more than 10 seconds later, there was a huge bang at my front door and I hear the handle being played with. when he finally stopped with the door handle, I heard the window downstairs shatter into shards, and I heard him climb in. I sprinted into my bathroom and locked the door behind me, bringing my phone with me. I hear really fast thumps go up the stairs and hear my bedroom door open, and once he realizes I'm not there, he immediately goes for the bathroom door handle. He starts trying to kick the door down and was screaming that he would rape and kill me. I called 999, and within 5 minutes I hear,
Put your hands up. Do it, now.
I was so fucking terrified that it took me almost 30 minutes to get out of the bathroom. The officer told me that he had a backpack, and in there they found dildos, condoms, a rope, a gag, bleach, and a meat cleaver. Also, I want to add that if the officers had arrived 5 minutes later, then I don't know what would have happened to me, as within about 5 kicks, he would have kicked the door down, and I don't know what would have happened to me if he did get in. This was a truly horrifying experience.
Number 1.
I think Reddit is the only place I feel anonymous right now. This whole week, I've either gotten a text message or phone call asking if I was sleeping. I've gotten friend requests and follows by different profiles with different names but with all the same picture, just a red block. This would be followed up without fail by a guy in a red hoodie pounding on my door every night this week around 10:30. Right now, I'm waiting for it to happen again. I live by myself in the city and half of my apartment complex is completely empty. In my end, the nearest person to me is on the other side of the pool. I don't deal in drugs. I don't browse the deep web or any stupid shit like that. I'm afraid to answer the door, and the police said that they'd cruise by around 10:30 twice this week and haven't showed up. I expect them tonight as well, but who knows? I guess because I'm a guy, they don't put much effort into it. Edit. These are some updates I've been sharing with everyone. He came by again, waiting for police.
He's fucking there again. He's fucking there again. Oh, fuck. Dude, I don't want to. What the
Whole lot of nothing from police. They started accusing me of being on drugs and said my video doesn't prove much. Fuck my life. This guy has me so paranoid I haven't slept in 2 days. I have no one to call and I work from home. I've only been in this city for 3 months. What the fuck am I gonna do? An old friend got me through the night on Skype. I'll be going to the police station in a few hours. Can't do another night here. 5 hours at the police station today. I'm getting the runaround. All I asked was for a police officer to be at my door from 10 to 11. They said that that was impossible. Then they told me pretty much the same kind of things you guys are telling me. Baseball bat, gun, stay with a friend, etc. I left after giving them all the evidence I had and filed a police report. I've been talking with some neighbours across the way and one said that they've seen the guy come to my door before and invited me to come stay with them between 10 and 11 tonight. If I get a clear shot, I'll try to take a video with my phone, but I'm more interested in getting this guy caught, so that will be secondary. And I would like to also thank the anonymous Reddit hacker that has offered to help me find him through his fake profiles. He's working on it now. One thing I just remembered was when I first moved in here, this tweaker guy that would ask me for money every time I came back in the morning after breakfast. I refused and got in a huge argument with him, but haven't seen him for 2 months. That's the only person I can think of who I've pissed off since I moved into the city. Any exes or would-be enemies are 1,000 miles away. I'll keep you guys posted. Look for an update around 11 PM, which is 5.5 hours from this post time. I think it's way worse than I thought. I set my old phone up because it's the only other camera I have on my windowsill.
I went across and waited at the neighbours. We saw the guy walk up and spot the camera and walk away. He didn't even knock. We waited for a little over an hour for this, and right when we came back, there was only 30 seconds left on the SD card.
Number 4.
At 3 a.m, we stopped at a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. By the middle of nowhere, I mean the middle of nowhere. The gas station was the only building in the area, and it was surrounded by empty fields. It was maybe 2 miles off of the interstate. At 3 a.m, it was pitch black outside, and the lights at the gas station were the only thing that illuminated the area. Since the gas station was closed, we were the only people there. My husband filled up the Jeep and we spent a few minutes rummaging through our bags because I couldn't find my purse. Turns out I had left it in a relative's car in Chicago. Whoops. After a while, an SUV pulled up right next to us. The driver was a white man in his late 20s or early 30s. At that point, I was sitting in the passenger seat and my husband was about to get into the driver's seat. The man approached my husband and said,
I lost my phone here. Have you seen it?
Suddenly, a sense of dread filled the pit of my stomach as I noticed that he already had a phone, a flip phone on his hip. I studied his face. While he looked unassuming, there was something off about him, something sinister.
I must have left it in the field over there,
he said. The field was pitch black.
Can you help me look for it?
My husband already had his iPhone out with the flashlight on. He's such a good Samaritan. He started to follow the man. I whipped out my phone and texted him, "Leave." My husband immediately saw the text and looked at me. I must have looked terrified because he ran, jumped into the car and we booked it out of there. As we were leaving, I looked back and saw the man get into his car. We drove for about 20 miles on the interstate to a rest stop and slept there. After a short time, my husband woke me up and told me to look through the passenger side window. The man had pulled up right next to us. There were some empty parking spaces at the rest stop, and he still parked next to us. The creepy part is that we were parked at the very end of the rest stop, and the spot next to us wasn't even a parking space. We had our seats down to help us sleep, so he probably didn't see us in our Jeep. We quietly watched him get out of his car, look over our Jeep, and walk into the building, probably looking for us. As soon as he entered the building, we snapped our seats back up and hauled ass out of there. We drove for about 50 miles and found a hotel about 6 miles north of the interstate. We never saw him again.
Number 3.
I grew up in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. When I was younger, our town used to get feet upon feet of icy white snow that glistened like diamonds in the sun. Snowmobiles have always been a huge part of my childhood, and I've been riding them for as long as I can remember. My father and I would take the sled out every time we had the chance, which was usually every weekend, or weekend if the ground was still white. Because we were so addicted to the thrill of driving fast down vast, sometimes blinding trails, my father spent a decent amount of time and money customizing his sled. We had a Firecat. As I was very young at this time, I really don't have any other information on the snowmobile, but I remember driving it before this incident and overheating it because I drove it too slow. It was a fast beast of a machine, and we would often take it off jumps and bluffs throughout the off-trails. At this time, I was too big to sit between my father's arms with my hands on the steering wheel, so I would ride passenger on the seat behind my father, holding on to him to prevent from flying off. I remember it was St. Patrick's Day, and there was a freak snowstorm the night before. We rarely had snow this late into the year, and so, being the fanatics we were, my dad took the day off work, allowed me to take the day off school, and we took the Firecat out for her last journey of the year. We left while the sun was still low, hoping to make the most of the entire day. We initially took our familiar trails, enjoying the warm air and sun in our suits. Eventually, my father decided to take a trail he had not seen before. It was mostly hidden by small birchlings and went down a somewhat winding path through a thickening forest. We loved anything that gave us an overload of nature's beauty, so he absent-mindedly took the unknown trail. At this point, the sun was high in the clear blue sky. We had already stopped for gasoline twice, stopping for coffee and donuts as well. The snow began to melt, and the trail was more of a deep boggy brown than it was white. Other snowmobilers had the same idea as we did: get on the trail for the last time of the season. Technically, the season had already ended that year. This was a bonus day to ride. As we continued down the path, we realized that the sled was trudging through the mud. Patches of the trail contained pools of dark, icy water. We continued on, being the stubborn fools that we were, veiled by curiosity. The puddles began to expand though. Each one was larger than the one before, and at one point, the water had splashed up over the side of the machine and wet my boots. The trees around us got denser, until we could no longer see anything beyond the shadows of its branches. After about half an hour of slowly navigating through the maze of mud and twigs, we came upon a group of snowmobilers, covered from head to toe in mud, resting at the entrance of a huge body of water. The puddle took up the entire trail and stretched into the distance by a good 200 yards. My father and I stopped and greeted the four gentlemen on the idle snowmobiles. He exchanged pleasantries about the snow and the weather and asked the man in the green suit, "Is it safe to cross?" The green man paused for a moment. None of them had removed their helmets. He cracked his visor just enough for us to see his chin and bottom lip. He smiled.
"Oh yeah, man. You've got a Firecat. You can make that for sure."
My dad laughed and nodded. We inched our way to the water. Usually, for shallow puddles, we drove slow as not to splash slushy water up onto our boots, or shoot it at any unfortunate people that happened to be behind us. As we crept through the water, the levels began to rise higher and higher. Before my father knew it, the snowmobile, it was beginning to sink. He pinned the throttle, but to no avail. We were going under. The back end of the snowmobile began to sink first, which is where I was sitting. I would like to mention that I was a very small child. I looked more like the size of a 6-year-old rather than an 8 or 9. I had a bright hot pink puffy snowsuit on and a bright yellow snowmobile helmet. There was no way that these men on the trail didn't notice a child on the back of my father's sled. My father tried not to panic. He quickly stood up and carefully lifted me to stand on top of the seat so I wouldn't get wet. He turned back to the 4 men on the trail and threw his arms up in a kind of gesture of, "Hey, what do you do?" He expected them to try to help, but instead we could distinctly see Green Man's shoulders shake as he laughed at us. He then directed his crew to follow him as he turned around and drove away. My father's hands dropped to his sides. We stood in silence for a moment. The snowmobile was still sinking. We realized that this was no puddle. The runoff from the melted snow had flooded the trail. We were basically sinking into a pond. At this point, the entire back end of the machine was underwater. The hood stood afloat, so the deep glugging from the exhaust underwater filled the silence around us. The lights on the snowmobile began to flicker, and we saw, to our dismay, the front end start to sink as well. My father panicked. He had a cell phone in the front pocket of his snowsuit, but he doubted that he'd get coverage out here. The snow may have been melting, but it was still only about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, and chunks of ice attacked our machine as they dragged it into the abyss. He knew my snowsuit wasn't going to protect me from hypothermia, so he picked me off of the sinking sled and attempted to put me on a bent sapling so I could balance above the water. While moving, my father lost his footing and we both fell into the painfully cold water. I was able to grab the sapling and pull myself onto its horizontal body, so only my legs got wet. My dad fell backwards and nearly fully submerged himself from impact. He jumped back and mistakenly grabbed onto the sled, which now sit dead in his hands. He threw his helmet off of his head into the water and ripped open his jacket to find his wet cell phone. When he looked at me, I saw fear in his eyes. "We have to walk, kiddo," he said quietly. "We have to go forward. We are closer to the end than we are the beginning. We have to walk through the water quick as you can, okay?" I started to cry then. The tears stung as they froze to my cheeks. My helmet didn't have a visor, so other than a wet cloth mask, my face was exposed to the elements. I nodded and took his hand. He walked through the icy cold water and bent saplings along the way so I could walk on them. The water stretched vastly on either side of us. We walked for a couple of yards when the pond opened up. The water was shallow here, but it was muddy, sticky, and there was nothing to walk on. My father lifted me up on his shoulders and began walking with me, but he continued to trip and slip as his feet sloped in the thick mud under the water. At one point, my father's foot caught on a fallen tree hidden in the darkness below. He fell forward, basically throwing me like a football. He landed face first into the water and struggled to maintain his composure. My butt hit the water first, and I was able to get to my feet relatively quickly. Behind me, I heard my father struggling to get to his feet and heard him call to me. "Just keep going, kiddo. Keep walking. You're almost there. You can do it. I'm right behind you." I didn't hesitate. I began to wade through the waist-deep water toward the shore that was mere feet away from me now. The sticky mud threatened to steal my boots with every step. Finally, I heard splashing behind me and felt my father put his hand on my shoulder and urge me to move faster. He was basically half dragging me through the pond when it happened. The mud won. I lost my left boot and it took my sock with it. I screamed at my father, but he knew that we couldn't go back. His fingers were beginning to lose its grip on my wrist, and I was getting very, very tired. Finally, he pulled me on shore and winced as I cried when my frozen foot hit muddy snow. He took off his wet glove and wrung it out before shoving it uncomfortably on my foot. He tried to spread my toes through a couple of the fingers so it would fit, but my toes were balled up like a fist and were frozen that way. The air was getting colder the longer we walked through the unfamiliar forest. I noticed ice crystals clinging to my father's crunchy snowsuit, and no doubt my own as well. He was carrying me, but his entire body ached, and he couldn't do it anymore. He could barely carry his own weight, let alone mine, so he let me use his arm as a crutch and half dragged me for what seemed like hours. I could no longer feel my foot at this point, and I was having a hard time keeping my eyes open. Suddenly, my father jerked me forward forcefully. He began sprinting. I had a hard time keeping up and began to cry for him to slow down. He didn't listen. In fact, I think he sped up. At some point, he had regained his strength and had picked me up and effortlessly threw me over his shoulder like a rucksack. I was confused until I saw it. A clearing, a road, a house. The house was an old farmhouse, and honestly, I thought it was abandoned. My father marched right up to the front door and banged on it furiously. An elderly woman answered the door, and before my father could even speak, ushered us inside the house. She sat us in front of a fireplace and threw thick, scratching wool blankets over our shoulders. We didn't complain. My father began to tell the woman our story. I could finally feel my foot again, but now my body stung as if it was on fire. Every inch of my exposed skin felt like it was being licked by the flames in the fireplace. The woman's husband came home with the only family vehicle, and he drove my father and I straight to the hospital. I had severe pneumonia and was undergoing the first stages of hypothermia. My foot recovered, but I had to stay in the hospital for a few days. My father was released a couple of hours later and went home to tell the family what had happened and bring me some of my personal items. He put an article in the newspaper telling the exact story of what had happened and a very specific description of the 4 snowmobilers that left us for dead. He had hoped someone would come to him with information, but we never heard anything. The following day, while my mother visited me in the hospital, my father and a couple of his friends took some ATVs back into the trail to pull out the snowmobile. After an entire afternoon of attempts, the Firecat was finally freed from her icy prison. My father had towed it home, and it sat for 2 weeks in the garage. He said that we had probably walked at least 20 minutes after the sled sunk before we found the couple that saved us. I was released from the hospital a couple of days later. I felt much better, but was a little nervous about going on a snowmobile again. My mother dropped me off at my father's house, and I found him in the garage, working on the Firecat. He would eventually get it to start and run almost perfectly. We used it the following 3 seasons, before selling it one summer.
Number 2.
This didn't happen to me. However, I did witness the incident, and it creeps me out to this day. Back in junior high school, there was this popular kid named Ryan that used to bully me, and tons of other people in our school. Ryan was the type of kid that thought that he was the best in the world because he was the captain of the football team. The kid that bullied nerds and cheated on his girlfriends. You know the type. Ryan's father ran an automotive parts store. His specialty was paint jobs and window tinting. He had many vehicles, but his favourite was a dark blue truck with orange and yellow flames on the front. It also had tinted windows and spinning hubcaps on the wheels. Ryan's father often wore the same team jersey as his son's team jersey, a red and white hat and blue jeans. As we continue the story, you will soon discover why the details of this particular truck, as well as its owner, are very important. One day, on my way to my next class, I fell down the stairs and sprained my ankle. I ended up limping to the nurse's office and calling my dad to come pick me up. After that, I sat in the waiting area looking out for my dad's car. About 5 minutes after I left the nurse's office, Ryan walked into the waiting area and sat down. Bored out of his mind, Ryan decided to talk to me while we were waiting for our dads to pick us up. I guess he felt safe talking to a nerd since his friends weren't around. So, I begrudgingly decided to be polite with him and made small talk. About 5 or so minutes later, Ryan looked out the glass doors and saw his father pulling into the entrance of the school. Ryan said, "See you later, man," picked up his backpack and headed towards the glass doors. He was about to push the door open when he suddenly stopped and paused. When I asked him what was wrong, Ryan explained to me that his father usually picked him up later, and that he usually parked his truck right next to the glass doors. Instead, Ryan's dad was 20 minutes early. The truck was next to the flagpoles, which were much further away, and the hubcaps appeared to be different and didn't even spin. After a few minutes of this, Ryan's cell phone then went off. Ryan at this point simply assumed that it was his dad calling and didn't pick it up. So he walked out the door and headed towards the truck. I decided to take a nap while I waited for my own dad to pick me up. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like an older man yelling and Ryan screaming. I looked out the window only to see Ryan flailing his arms and an older man trying to pull him into the truck. Because of my ankle, I couldn't run to Ryan's aid, so I shouted to the nurse as well as to the other staff members to get help. One of the nurses immediately called the police. A couple of secretaries ran towards the truck to help Ryan. Upon seeing the secretaries running towards him, the creep shoved Ryan away and climbed further into his truck. The guy then sped off and disappeared into the intersection that led into a nearby highway. Ryan at this point was crying in pain, mainly because the guy had pepper sprayed him. The secretaries helped pull Ryan to his feet and guided him to the nurse's office. About a few minutes later, the police, along with Ryan's real father, arrived. The police, as well as an ambulance, tended to Ryan while a couple of police officers interviewed me and the other witnesses. Because I was the only student that witnessed this, the police, as well as Ryan's dad, asked me to stay in touch and hang out with Ryan, just so that he could have a shoulder to lean on and recover emotionally. So, I swallowed my pride and gave Ryan my phone number. From that day forward, Ryan was a completely different person. The same person who used to body slam me into lockers was now in constant fear and used my body as a shield instead of a punching bag. There wasn't a day at school where Ryan wasn't around me. He was especially clingy and paranoid when it came to having his dad pick him up. I would have to hold his hand and stay there with him until his dad came around. It even got to the point that Ryan would call me every night to vent his fears, as well as update me on what the police would find. And many of the details about this were very, very creepy. For instance, the creep, whoever he was, not only knew where Ryan went to school and where he got picked up, he even knew which vehicle Ryan's dad drove whenever he picked up his son from school. So he decided to imitate everything about Ryan's father. That's right, the creep actually went through the trouble of painting his own truck the same colors as the father's, just to fool and lure Ryan and his father. Yet, things got even creepier the more Ryan told me, and the more the police department found. As it turns out, the creep also knew Ryan's cell phone number, but wasn't the one who called Ryan. Ryan told me that the police said the mysterious number belonged to a payphone at a nearby gas station, so the creep in the truck couldn't have possibly called Ryan, meaning that not one, but two people may have been involved in this. Despite having video surveillance, a license plate, and a description of the driver, the police never found the guy, or his gas station buddy. And even then, the creep continued to terrorize Ryan and his dad. About 3 months after the truck incident, Ryan called me in the middle of the night, this time in hysterics. Someone had thrown several Molotov cocktails at Ryan's house. A couple of them even hit and shattered a window and set a part of his house on fire. About a month after the Molotov cocktails were thrown, someone, most likely the same creep, set fire to Ryan's father's business. Ryan and his father moved out of the area not long after. The creep also disappeared, leaving everyone else to wonder just who that creep was. Was the creep a disgruntled parent or relative of a student that Ryan bullied? Was he the enraged parent or relative of one of Ryan's many ex-girlfriends? Was he a dissatisfied customer of Ryan's father? Or was he just some random creep that liked to terrorize teenage boys? The possibilities as to who this guy was and why he, as well as his accomplice, would target Ryan were endless. With Ryan now gone, I quickly found myself getting very frightened over the possibility of the same creep coming after me. For a long time, I was super paranoid about the creep coming after me and subjecting me to even worse terror than Ryan had experienced. From that day forward, I refused to be picked up from school, no matter how sick or hurt I was. All because I feared that some creep was going to do the same thing to me. Even to this day, the whole incident sends shivers down my spine.
Number 1.
I work at a big name retail company in the United States. I've been at my store for going on 9 years now, so as you can imagine, I have a good amount of friends who work in the building. This story happened about 3 years ago, before I became a manager, but pretty far into my career in the building. During the holiday season, we hire on a lot of seasonal team members. Some stay and some go. Amongst the new faces in the building was a younger guy called Matt. For his age, Matt had an amazing work ethic, going as far as to ski into work during a bad snowstorm rather than call out. I was told that he was an Eagle Scout, member of the Honor Society all through school. He was a weird kid, loner type, but he seemed to take to me pretty quickly. The department I worked in was towards the back of the store, and he was a backroom team member, so we saw a lot of each other. We chatted about things like video games and comics, mostly passing chatter. Have you played blank yet? It's amazing. That type of thing. Before long, he was adopting my break schedules, mostly to bum cigarettes. Matt ended up staying after the season ended, so I had a pretty consistent smoke buddy. One morning in January, he asked me if I knew someone called Jack. He went to the high school I graduated from, but both Matt and Jack were considerably younger than me. I told him I didn't know him. "Oh, okay," he said. "I was just asking because a friend asked me to deal with him. I'm kind of a protector in my circle and he's been messing with her." I brushed it off, mostly just surprised by the fact that he had friends outside of his work bubble. The next day, he came to me again, talking about Jack. I figured out where he lived, but there are so many cars in his driveway, I'm not sure which one is his. I need to be sure he's home, or if I do something, it's to his car. This sketched me out a bit, but being a semi-sane person, I assumed he was going to pull a childish prank. Still, I lied. Be careful in that area. My dad lives there and there's a lot of vandalism. Most homeowners have surveillance cameras out front. He didn't seem fazed by my statement and switched the conversation to the then new Zelda game. About a month or so had passed with no new inquiries or comments about Jack or his mission. I was relieved. I showed up to work as usual, and around 9:45 I took my smoke break. Matt usually worked later, so my first break was usually a solo one. But that day, he covered a shift. I was surprised when he followed me out and asked for a cigarette. I gave it to him and sat down to enjoy my break. "So I finally got that kid." The way he said it, it sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, okay. Well, I beat Zelda last night. It's a good game. You should get it." I tried to change the subject, but I could see he was going to continue talking. "Do you know what ricin is?" I admit I hadn't, so I shook my head. I wish I could say I still don't. For those of you who also don't know, from what I'm told, ricin is a particularly deadly poison with no scent or taste that, when ingested, can be lethal within 3 days. Not a Breaking Bad fan, I guess? I shook my head again, but by then he was already rattling on about how to make it and what it did. "It's lethal, odorless and tasteless. No antidote either. I put it on a scratch and sniff card and walked it to his house last night. His birthday was recently, so he shouldn't be surprised by it." Right away, a million thoughts rushed into my head. I come from a large, close family. If I had a card in my mailbox, hand addressed and without a return address on it, I know for a fact that one of my siblings or parents would have opened it. As much as I wanted to believe that he was just trying to sound like a badass, I couldn't bring myself to leave that to chance. I pretended I hadn't heard him, continued my Zelda talk and headed back in. Once inside, I alerted my direct superior and sat in an office to call the police. 2 plainly clothed detectives came in shortly after and questioned me pretty extensively. They agreed that it was more than likely not true, but were glad I reported it regardless and were on their way. Matt worked through the rest of his shift and left with another backroom team member. Shortly after they left, the detectives returned. The card that was in the mailbox had something in it, but they couldn't be sure what it was. It had to go to a lab for testing. They went to Matt's house and talked to him. He said that he put powder in the card to try and scare him, and that was it. The next week was crazy. The lab results came back positive for a particular potent batch of ricin. Matt attempted to flee his home while a hazmat team knocked on the door. He hid the remaining poison in a storm drain close by where it was quickly found. Matt was arrested and I planned on going back to my normal life. Not the case though. News reporters and journalists were at my job, my home and both of my parents' homes daily. I had to wear another girl's name badge so they didn't know who I was, but they knew. They would come back to my department, referring to me in third person and trying to pet my ego. It didn't work. I had very clear directions to not discuss the incident. Besides, I wanted to be done with the whole situation. My dickhead, now ex-boyfriend, kicked me out because of the reports and police. I just wanted to go back to being normal. I met with the family of the would-be victim. The mother and father were very nice, thanking me and crying. The mum had painted me an angel as a thank you gift, and though I'm not religious, I've held on to it. The brother was a paraplegic with a seizure disorder. He couldn't take care of himself at all. The sister, who was opening the mailbox as the police called the house, was a 2-time cancer survivor, and Jack, the eldest, was there with his girlfriend. It turns out the reason Matt tried to kill Jack was because he was dating an ex of his. That's absolutely insane to me, but clearly this kid was not the most sane. I met with them a few times for trial prep, all scheduled works in advance, all fairly redundant. Until one day, I got a call very late from a woman I'd never talked to before. She was with a victims protection agency, and she needed to meet with me at the courthouse the following morning. In the room was myself, the family, the original DA and detectives, as well as a new DA and a new set of detectives. They passed around a photocopy of a letter handwritten from Matt to another inmate who was due to be released soon. I can't remember exactly what was written, but there were very graphic, disturbing plans for each of us. He offered up a trust fund that may or may not exist, leaning towards not since he was using a public defender to beat an attempted murder charge. If the other inmate did things like kidnap our families and burn them on our lawns while we watched from inside the house, remove our tongues and eyelids and force us to drink bleach. There was a distinct plan for each of us, but like I said, I don't remember most of it. He's since been sentenced and sent upstate. His trial seemed to go on forever, finally ending a few months ago. I don't think he's been charged for the second case, the threatening letter to the other inmate, just yet. But I'm not supposed to go to those trials, so I may never know.
Number 7.
About a year ago, for the month of June, my family went to France for 4 weeks and left me to tend to the house and take care of the animals. My house is in an interesting location. It is an hour from the campus I go to school on, and a 30-minute drive from my work, and 20 minutes from the main town. My neighbours and I have a few acres in between each other, and the closest house to me is a 10-minute drive. My house is surrounded by farmers' fields, military property, and then miles and miles of BLM land surrounded by mountains. Sometimes I feel like I live in the house from Courage the Cowardly Dog because of how in the middle of nowhere it is and how lots of weird stuff happens in it. If you were to Google what a 2-story house looks like, this would be exactly what my house looks like, except it's 1 story. The second story, where all the windows are, is just ceiling space. There are also lofts in my house where my landlord was going to put the second story but never got around to it. It was like they tried to build a 2-story house but realized that there was nowhere to put the stairwell. There is also a large basement and an attic. I have lived in this house for 8 years and have always felt that the house had a weird layout. Next to my room, there is a huge wall that connects to the living room wall, but my room isn't as big as the wall, so there is just a large wall in between the living room and my room. Underneath my room is the stairs to the unfinished basement. So, now that you understand the layout of my house, you'd understand why there would be a lot of birds' nests on the roof. The birds congregate on top of the room during the summer because that's when the most bugs are out for them to catch, and because we feed our cat just below. My room acts like a funnel for the noise of them scratching on the roof and running around. About 2 weeks after my family left for France, the birds started their scratching noises on top of my roof. They do it every hour or so, all day and all night. It's a very unsettling sound to hear at 3 in the morning, and annoying. But then I started to hear scratching and banging sounds coming from the wall next to me, which is why I thought we had rats in our walls. My mum assured me over Skype that it was probably just birds on the roof, like normal. Over the next few days, I kept hearing the scratching noises and the banging sounds coming from my wall. Finally, I decided that it was time to check the closets and the basement for signs of mice or rats so I could buy the proper traps. After checking the basement, I don't find any signs of mice. So I go check the hall closet, which is the only thing in between my living room and my room. It's usually locked because it's full of a bunch of yard tools and my stepdad's shotgun, my archery equipment, and a handgun. It's locked because my youngest brother could seriously injure himself. I assume it's locked, but I still check the handle, and it opens. I thought maybe my stepdad unlocked it before they left in case I needed a gun to protect myself. The first thing I notice when I open the closet is that all of the tools are moved to the far side, and a portion of the closet wall is missing. At this point, I'm freaking the fuck out and call my best friend and her dad to come over and check it out. I thought about calling the police, but since I live far from a lot of things, I figured me discovering a hole in the wall of my closet probably wasn't enough to send them out. My best friend's dad and brother came over and used flashlights to look into the hole. They don't see anything super weird, so my friend's dad gets on his hands and knees and gets into the hole. When he gets out, he has a look of horror on his face and tells us that he found a dirty mattress, a pair of men's-sized jeans, chicken feathers everywhere, and a whole Walmart rotisserie chicken partially eaten. He calls the police and they search the whole house and find no one, and nothing out of the ordinary. My friend's dad nails a slab of wood over the hole, and I have all the locks changed. The creepy compartment in my closet has since then been sealed up. The scary thing is that because I work during the day and leave the house unlocked most of the time, the guy who lived in there could have come and gone as he pleased until nighttime when I was home. I have 8 dogs, which is the reason my family needed me to stay home, and I never heard any of them bark during the time the banging started, which means The man probably lived in my house a long time, and my dogs got used to him.
Number 6.
I live in a pretty big Midwest city, about 35 minutes north of my hometown. I live in one of the stereotypical not so great areas of town, which is fine with me because it's cheap and my neighbours are great. I live with my best friend and his husband. They're high-ranking Buddhist monks. Yes, really. So they travel a lot, which means I'm left alone in my house about 6 months of the year. For the past month or so, I've been experiencing some really strange shit. Not paranormal, but someone is fucking with me. A few weeks ago, 2 of my tyres got slashed. Okay, fine, whatever. I have insurance and roadside assistance anyway. A few days after that, my back window got smashed in. I drive a baby Kia Soul, and spray painted across the back was the word cunt. When I walked outside the next morning, I barely noticed it, but the street lamp made it pretty obvious. Needless to say, I was really upset. By the way, I honestly don't have any enemies. I have like maybe 5 or 6 friends that I hang out with on a weekly, bi-weekly basis. Other than that, I'm at work or home. So I went to work that day, smashed back window and all, and worked through the longest day of my life. I work 8 AM to 5:30 PM. At about 1 PM, I got a text from an unknown number with a bunch of laughing emojis. I didn't think anything of it because, you know, that 2016 life, Facebook, Tinder, etc. So I went home without any real worries that night and had some wine because it was a super shitty day. It wasn't until about 8 PM that night that I started getting really scared. That same random number that had been texting me sporadically throughout the day, but I didn't respond. Once I was home by myself, I got a text from the same number saying, "You look so pretty and relaxed. I hope you enjoy that book." I was having my 3rd glass of wine and reading a book at the time, so I was thoroughly terrified. I called my best friend, ex-military and super scary. He's been here for a few days now, and I've still had a few creepy texts that only he replies to. It stopped for a day or so, but now we're sitting here in my bedroom, and we just heard someone knock on my door. It's 11:18 PM on a Tuesday. My friend went to go check with a gun. As soon as he left my room, someone knocked on my window a few times. I'm honestly not sure what to do now. My best friend can't stay here for weeks, and my other friend won't be home for another 3 months. Edit. I called the police on my way to work today. I'm going to talk to them this afternoon. Edit. I went to the police station last night after work and gave them all the information. Since there's been damage to property and the possibility of this person being in or around my house, they said that it's now an active investigation. I did try Googling the number, but nothing came up because it's a cell phone. Not sure if those are public. And Facebook didn't turn anything up either. After reading through a lot of private messages and comments, I tried to dissect my life as much as possible to think of who this person could be. I've narrowed my list down to only one person. I gave their name to the police as well. Hopefully, this ends soon because I'm ready to move on with my life and not be terrified of my own home. Thank you to everyone for all of the kind words and great suggestions. I'll let you guys know if anything comes up. Edit. After going through my life, like I said before, I think that I've narrowed it down to someone that I had a short, no-commitment relationship with about 4.5 years ago. He tried to contact me about 6 or 7 months ago, but I wasn't interested in having him be a part of my life again. He not only knows where I live, but he knows where I used to live as well, my parents' house, because he's my mum's next-door neighbour. The police haven't been a huge help. I'm not sure what to do now. If it is him, I'm not just scared for myself, but my mum as well.
Number 5.
So, for the past few weeks, my sister's been complaining of hearing what she calls a phantom radio coming from her closet. She says she can hear it on and off throughout the day when it's really quiet in the house, but that it's a near constant thing throughout the night. It sometimes plays music. She can't quite tell what kind, but she says she thinks it's kind of a bit like old-timey jazz. She says she can hear trumpet or saxophone melodies. Other times, she claims that she can hear talking like it's a radio show. She says there's definitely a man's voice speaking, but it sounds like he's having a conversation with someone. She can't make out what's being said. The way our room's set up, our closets share a wall, so we've both dug through our closets from top to bottom, trying to see if there was maybe an old MP3 player or radio that ran on batteries that could be making the noise, but neither of us have anything like that in our closets. I can't hear anything from my side either, but I have heard it while in her room. We can track the noise to the closet, but it never gets any louder or clearer no matter how close we get. She says that when she gets too close, it just stops, but it'll start back up again when she moves away. It's keeping her up at night. She's taken to sleeping on our living room couch sometimes because she says the noise is constant. And just as she's getting used to the music or the talking and is able to tune it out and fall to sleep, it'll change and wake her up again. She says she feels like it knows just when to do it to keep her from falling asleep. Last night, she slept in my room with me. Now, we're two grown women. We haven't shared a bed in at least 15 years. But last night, about 2:45 a.m., she burst into my room and dove into my bed with me. She was shaking and crying and more terrified than I've ever seen her. She said she was in her room trying to sleep because it was quiet for the first time in a week. She was just about to fall to sleep when she heard it start up again. It was talking this time, and on reflex or out of irritation or whatever, she looked over into the corner of her room and glimpsed at a dark shadow. She says as soon as she saw it, it moved or disappeared, and she couldn't quite tell if it was in her room or outside her window. We have huge floor-to-ceiling windows on one wall of our rooms, and she couldn't tell what side of the glass it was on. As soon as she told me, we peeked out my window, which is about 5 feet away from hers, but we couldn't see anybody or anything. We're pretty sure that if it was someone outside, we would have heard them moving around in the leaves and sticks and stuff outside our windows. Plus, we don't think that there was enough time for them to get away from the house without us seeing them. Our house sits on a pretty big lot and it's a lot of open land, so there's nothing for anyone to hide behind or anything like that. I don't really know what to do or what to say to help her. I haven't personally experienced anything except hearing the radio when I've been in her room. We haven't had anything weird happen in any other parts of the house either, as far as I know. I'm a skeptic by nature, so I'm inclined to think that her mind was playing tricks on her last night, but she's positive about what she saw. I have absolutely no explanation for the radio noises. Have any of you heard about anything like this happening? Or do you have any ideas about what we should do about it? Any advice would be greatly appreciated.
Number 4.
In August, I moved into my first apartment. I graduated from university, was offered a job as a teacher, and was well on my way to figuring out this whole adult life. I moved in with a longtime friend and neither of us had any complaints about our apartment complex. Our complex is really nice. It's not in a wonderful part of town, but it's truly a diamond in the rough. The complex is well maintained, clean, and other members have been nothing but friendly. If you live at the apartments, you are given a remote that opens the gate of your choosing, but if you don't live at the complex, you have to go through a directory at the front to find the name of the resident you are looking for. Once you have found the resident's name, it appears as last name, first initial. It calls the resident's phone and gives the resident a few options. The resident can choose to talk to the person who has called them and decide to let them in by entering in their key code in the dial pad on their cell phone, or they can hang up and the gates will not be opened. Overall, I think this system helped to save me from this situation I got myself into. One night in October, I was driving home from my fiance's house. It was late at night, probably close to 2 a.m. I had just gotten off of the freeway and was about to enter into my neighborhood when I was stopped at a traffic light. I was in the left-hand turn lane and there was one other car in the right-hand turn lane 2 lanes away from me. The light changed to a green arrow and I proceeded to turn left, and the car, which had previously been in the right-hand turn lane, maneuvered to follow me. I thought this was weird because of how many lanes they cut across, but I figured that they were lost, so I tried not to think much of it. I continued driving down the road and was about to make a right-hand turn into my neighborhood and was distressed to see that the car turned in behind me. Still, I ignored my gut feeling and figured they lived in the neighborhood around my complex. I remember thinking that they were driving just a little bit too close, but again, I tried not to let my anxiety get the best of me. I do have high anxiety, so I figured it was just my brain playing tricks on me. I remember from hearing stories on here that the best way to tell if someone is following you is by turning right multiple times to form a square of sorts. But I talked myself out of this maneuver. I wish I hadn't. I sped up just a bit, clicked my gate open and pulled into the complex. Again, I convinced myself that this was normal. They probably lived in the complex too, right? The gate opens on the opposite side of the apartments, so you have to drive through the entire complex to get to where my apartment is. I drove through quickly. I was prepared to exit the complex just in case the person was still following me, but when I looked at the straightaway right behind me, I realized that there weren't any headlights following me anymore. I laughed at myself for being so nervous and pulled into my parking lot in front of my building. As I parked and prepared to get out of the car, I turned for one last look and realized that the car that had been following me had reappeared with their headlights off, and they parked in an unreserved spot just a bit down from my own. I knew that I should have turned my car back on and drove away. I knew there were so many other things I should have done, but in a moment of panic, I jumped out of my car and ran up the stairs and into my apartment. I double-locked the doors, grabbed a knife and ran into my room to call my fiancée. I heard someone shouting from outside, which is very unlike my complex. It's very quiet. But I refused to listen to what they were saying as I told my fiancée what had just happened. I suddenly heard more voices shouting, and then it was silent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I remember not being able to stand because my knees were shaking so much, and I tried to stop myself from crying so I would be able to see if someone broke down my door. My fiancé made it to my apartment in record time with a baseball bat for me to help ease my mind. He stayed that night and let me sleep with the lights on. I couldn't get the sound of screaming out of my head. It was obvious they were calling for someone, and I figured that it must have been me. I assumed the other person screaming must have been another resident who was trying to make the other person be quiet during the early morning hours. I figured the whole situation was over until I woke up in the morning. When I walked downstairs to my car, I discovered that one of my tires had been viciously slashed to ribbons. I then realized that I had left some mail with my name on it in my car in my hurry to exit the night before. I didn't think much of that detail until later. I got my tire fixed and tried to push that night out of my mind. A few days later, however, I started to receive calls from the directory in front of my building to let someone in. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered and asked who was calling for me. I was met with silence, so I hung up and didn't grant access into the complex. Again, I was called and the same procedure was repeated, and again, no one answered. They called obsessively from the call box directory for days. I finally snapped into the phone for them to tell me who they were, and a man answered. He told me that he lived in the complex and needed to be let in because he lost his key. He told me that he lived in the apartment next to me. I knew the family who lived next to me. There was a woman with 4 children, but no man. And if he really did live there and lost his key, he would have been able to call himself to open the gate. I told him I didn't believe him and hung up just as he started screaming at me to let him in. And the calls continued. I marched to the office the next day and asked them to take my number off of the directory. The man was unable to call me now, and I felt at peace. I warned the office about the man who had damaged my car, and they increased security rounds in the complex for a few months. As anticlimactic as it is, that was the last contact I had with the weirdo, thankfully. I know how I handled the situation by not listening to my gut when it told me something was wrong, got me into trouble. I allowed someone to follow me and learn my name, and they were able to torment me for a few weeks before I finally took action. I am just thankful to my fiancé and the staff at my apartment for taking action to help me stop the creep from being able to contact me.
Number 3.
So, about 2 years ago, my family and I moved to a quiet neighborhood in the city we live in. It was really nice, good neighbors and nothing to complain about. Well, every now and then, my mum would take my dog out with her when she did the yard work. He is a black lab and is very protective, especially of my mum. One day, a scraggly looking guy came walking down the street, and when he got in front of our house, my dog freaked out. He even chased after the guy, which he never does. He mostly just keeps to himself in between us and anyone he's not familiar with, and will occasionally bark if they approach too quickly. After that happened, my mum apologized profusely, and after she tied my dog up, the man went on his way. A few days later, the same thing happened with the same guy. Again, my mum apologized and the guy left. After this happened another 2 times, my mum was really irritated and refused to take my dog out with her when she did the yard work. After a week, she once again took my dog out with her, thinking he would be fine. Well, the same thing happened. My dog freaked out, my mum apologized, and the guy left. At this point, my mum was really pissed at my dog and would only let him out if he was tied up, or me or my dad were there to help keep my dog away from people, even though he only freaked out at this one guy. Well, a few weeks went by and there was no sign of the scraggly wanderer. Then, one morning, my mum was reading the paper, and there was Mr. Scraggly. He had killed 2 girls in their early 20s about a block from where we were living. Moral of the story, get a murderer detecting dog like mine.
Number 2.
For the past 1 year and 9 months, I've been living alone and 9 hours away from home due to my job. I'm not the most social person. My gym manager and a few stray cats aside, I haven't made any friends in this city. I'm generally fine being alone, but after almost 2 years of solitude, and with Ramadan approaching, a usual festive and family-orientated time in my country, even I began to feel a bit lonely. So yesterday afternoon, as I was about to get off work, I started to contemplate my dreadful return to my empty flat and thought perhaps that it wouldn't be a bad idea to get a flatmate or move in with one. I'd actually been thinking about this for a few weeks. I got my phone out, quickly found a few ads and saved some numbers. Once home, I decided to call one I had saved as Mehdi Rent. Mehdi was apparently the landlord's name. He was renting out the still available room in his 2-bedroom flat. He sounded like a decent guy over the phone, and we decided to meet up near the supermarket in a few minutes, as I couldn't figure out the exact location of the flat. Still in my office attire, I headed out to meet him and was in front of the supermarket 5 minutes later. Some 15 minutes went by and there was still no sign of Mehdi. I called him again to let him know I was still there, and he confirmed that he was on his way. Soon afterwards, he showed up and greeted me with what seemed like excessive delight to me, the way you might greet someone you actually know and haven't seen for a long while. He proceeded to make small talk, and then casually asking a bunch of stuff I assume any landlord might ask. Examples of this were, "I'm guessing you're not from town. Are you a student? I look younger than I am. What do you do? Where are you from?" Stuff like that. I felt like he was being a bit overbearing, but thought nothing of it. Several awkward responses later, I asked if we could go see the flat. His smile changed into an inquisitive frown for the briefest moment before he resumed his exceedingly gleeful attitude and said,
Yes, of course.
I started walking behind him, and as we turned around the corner, he gestures to an old Renault 19. I had no idea he'd come by car and had assumed we were walking to the flat since it was supposed to be close to the supermarket. So
Number 5.
my boyfriend of 5 years and I recently moved to Texas from Iowa, where both of our families live, to a new subdivision outside of a small town. The house we bought is at the end of a cul-de-sac with a huge field with nothing but trees behind it. We were both so excited to be starting our new lives together and to have bought our first house. We also have 2 dogs that are basically our children. My boyfriend decided that he was going out with some new co-workers to the city about 35 minutes away. I didn't really feel like going, as I'm more of an introvert and large crowds really aren't my forte. Also, I usually love being home alone because I can binge snack and watch scary movies he never wants to watch. So after getting home around 6 PM from work and the grocery store, I barricade myself and the dogs in my bedroom to commence the scary marathon of awesomeness. Also, on a side note, my dogs become on edge when my boyfriend isn't home at night and randomly bark in the night at seemingly nothing. It freaks me out a bit, but I've become used to it. We have one window in our room that's right next to our bed. I usually have the windows open, letting the air in, but tonight I only cracked it open just a little. So I'm balls deep in some cheesy 80s horror flick, and the dogs start barking. Ugh, stop already. I always take notice when they bark, however, just in case. I turn the light on, look around, and nothing. So, lights off, and back to the dits running up the stairs. It's around 11 now, and I'm sure the boyfriend will be gone a couple more hours. No biggie. The dogs start barking again though, but this time they don't stop. So I slowly look out the window. I don't see anything until I catch it. At the bottom of the window, peering up at me, are a set of eyes. Not the whole face, not even the nose, just the eyes. The window is pretty low to the ground, so this man was crouching down. At first, I thought it was my boyfriend trying to scare me. We sometimes like to do that, but not to this extent. So, of course, I try to play it off like I'm not scared. Calvin, you're dumb. Seriously, it's not funny. The staring continues. Okay, you're really milking this now, fool. Hardy ha ha. Now, stop, really. You're freaking the dogs out. Then, the eyes start moving slowly, still on the window, so I can't see the face, but moving across it. Sliding up it now, so I can only see one eye until the man is standing up fully. Clearly too big to be my 5'11" boyfriend. I freeze.